Oh my god.
And I said, I don't need this anymore.
What the fuck? What are you talking about? What do you mean you don't need it?
I mean, I don't know now what I meant, but it meant a lot to me at the time.
It's pretty good.
Yeah. All right, let's be professionals here.
Okay. Anybody that's just tuning in now, you guys missed a lot of stuff that cannot ever be public, right? We were just talking for an hour and a half. Let me just disable some of this flux I got going on. But today we're gonna do something nice, right? We're gonna be talking about this book, Lost in the City. It's a book of short stories by Edward P. Jones. I believe it was published in maybe like 92, 93, early 90s at any rate. Yeah. Excellent stories, great stories. Even, the worst stories here are still, I'd say, pretty good. Or just
there's nothing bad.
Yeah, nothing bad. Yeah, nothing bad. And it's interesting because I've never done these kinds of shows with short stories before. And one of the challenging things is, unlike, for example, like a novel or whatever, there's a ton of characters and just like structural experiments and all this different stuff that you kind of have to keep fresh in your mind. So each one of us is perhaps a little bit more of an expert on some stories than the other guy. So we're going to maybe do a kind of like, do the rounds here, as it were. Mm-hmm. I mean, do you have like anything you want to say about the text, like in terms of introductions?
Only that it's weird because I've read it twice now.
Yeah.
In preparation for this. And the first time that I read it, I must admit it was kind of on the, I always say in terms of texts or works that I can recognize are very good to great, but do not move me in any way. Mm-hmm. I've always said, like last year in Marion Bad, or, a couple of other things. And I kind of put this in the same category the first time that I read it. Mm-hmm. But the second time that I read it in the last couple of days here, it's very moving. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it's like you have to be in the right headspace, or you have to maybe the first time it's just because it's a collection of short stories and it's like constantly shifting like the characters and the tone and the structure and things like that. You have to be familiar with that in order for it to be like an emotionally affecting thing. But mm-hmm. The second time I read it, deeply affecting work. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I read it for the first time in my like early mid-20s. So I definitely didn't appreciate it either. Like, reading it a second time and now a third time, I see like some of it's still the same edition that I had from back then. And I see like the little notes that I must have taken when I was like, 22 or whatever. And I'm thinking like, well, why didn't I make a note about this or about that? I think part of it is, many of these stories are very, very understated, right? He doesn't hit you over the head with either moralizing. There's like tons of like poeticisms in the text, but there's also a lot more kind of implied poeticism through understatement, right? So yeah, that's one of the techniques that he does very well in this book. So I can imagine definitely that if you're younger, first getting into literature, even if you understand literature as I think that I understood it then, it definitely, like, as you get older, understatement becomes one of those things that you appreciate more.
Yeah, it's also just it's adult literature, not mm-hmm. in the sense of like sexuality, but in the sense that like to appreciate the particular insights and perspectives that he's bringing, you kind of have to be a grown-up. You have to have been on your own. You have to have been self-supporting. You have to have experienced enough of the world that you sort of see the types of people that he is depicting and engaging with, and have formed your own opinion on them in order to sort of appreciate the angle that he is approaching it from. I mean, and there's not enough of that anymore. There's not a lot of, you go on Twitter, you go on a lot of these like places where people engage with these kind of things, and there's this really bad tendency in modern criticism to equate depiction with endorsements. Like there's a lot of bad people in this book, or people that are extremely flawed, and like you have to be able to separate a person's actions from the context that they take place in order to really properly appreciate something like this, or it's just going to be like an academic exercise, or like it's just another book of short stories that was on the shelf at the library. And really this particular book, as far as I am aware, it didn't really gain a lot of traction until after he published the book that he got was it the Pulitzer or the National Book Award that he got for
I think it was a Pulitzer for the Known World, I think.
Yeah, like this kind of flew under the radar until he published that kind of cultural behemoth of a work. And it's something that if you're not willing to sort of sit down in quiet and engage with it, it could easily just seem like, a bunch of like laconic, kind of boring stories about boring people, and especially as a 20-year-old, or even a 25-year-old, it's like, you just don't quite have the perspective to appreciate what he is doing with this that you do when you reach like your 30s and older. 30 is really like an inflection point in your cognition and your psyche and your understanding of the world, that you can't transmit it backwards. You can't correct people that are younger. You can't imbue them with like your insight or your wisdom or whatever. It's just like it's like it's a constellation of neurons that just they find the connection at a certain point.
You definitely want, especially as a younger person, the racial kind of like politics in this book, small p politics, to be more overt in some way, right? You want to sort of read into things that perhaps aren't there, right? So many of the stories, like we're going to talk about, like one of the best stories here, The Store. The race is a part of it, yes, but it's much more kind of subliminal, right? You can imagine if this was like, if these were white characters, you can imagine a situation where certain things might have played out differently, right? But for the most part, race is much more subtle here. And one thing that disappointed me, you mentioned that it hasn't really gotten as much attention as his other books. I was trying to look up Edward P. Jones' lectures, like he has like interviews, lectures, or whatever. He really barely talks about this collection at all, right? There's nothing that I was able to really find that was any kind of like substantive examination of these stories. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to do this artifact is because this will be the most substantive discussion of these stories that you could probably find anywhere at this point. And they're
he's
very
barely
worthwhile.
written anything, to be fair. I mean, he's one of those authors where you're like, how is it that in 30 years of being, a famous published author, you have 3 books?
Yeah.
You could have more. You won the fucking Pulitzer.
Yeah.
I mean, I get that some people are perfectionists. I mean, most famously, Ralph Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, which is a very good book that you probably could do another artifact about if you really wanted to. He basically dilly-dallied around for the rest of his career working on a very like a long novel called Juneteenth that wasn't it
Junebug?
No, Juneteenth is the name of the book.
It's not June. It's not Junebug.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, but he never finished it. He had like 2,000 pages of material that was compiled by a close collaborator after his death into like a 400-ish page. I don't know what you call it when it's like, it's not exactly a novel. It's like an attempted distillation of an intended novel, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then they've also released like the unredacted, 2,000 page opus that he wrote. But you know, so like, and Robert Frost, to go for a white author is kind of similar, where you're like, you really couldn't have written more than you wrote for as famous and as celebrated as you were.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like you didn't have more ideas, that you could play with and engage with.
Mm-hmm.
And one of his books is just not a sequel, like a spiritual and kind of sequel to this book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he wrote a book of short stories called Aunt Hagar's Children, I think.
Yeah,
that is essentially like every story in that book is either a sequel or like a spiritual sequel to the stories in this book in chronological order. And that makes you wonder why he doesn't talk about this book more and why it hasn't been more celebrated. But it also makes you wonder, like, you know, this man is a professor of creative writing. He's giving lectures. I don't know if he's done a TED Talk, but whatever is the 90s equivalent of a TED Talk. You know, like he is someone that is out there and engaging with people, but he himself apparently had very little to contribute to the culture relative to how great this book is. I haven't read The Known World, so I don't know if that's also a great book, but you know, he really has contributed relatively little to what his station could have enabled him to provide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's always interesting to have these kinds of like what if scenarios, and also just, I mean, psychologically wondering like what it is that compels certain people to create versus not. I mean, I could just imagine myself, like if I'm in a situation where I'm a professor somewhere and the expectation is that I simply, you know, I teach and I write books, teach and I write books, because there's always a publisher for your stuff, right? And there's always a national audience. That would always be extremely tempting, right? To, you know, have something out like every year, right? If you could essentially have this kind of a contract. But, you know, there's also other personalities, right? Like Kazuo Ishiguro, who wrote, you know, a couple of excellent to great books early in his career, and then just kind of like really stretched it out, right? He would spend many, many years in between books. And, you know, like who knows exactly what's behind that. But anyway, like to get all that out of the way, you said the opening story, The Girl Who Raised Pigeons, is your favorite story in the collection. And it's definitely one of my favorite stories. I think the following one, The First Day, is my favorite, but The Girl Who Raised Pigeons, it's a great story. It's about the character Robert and his daughter Betsy. Robert is a young father. I believe he's 19 when Betsy is born. The wife has cancer. So she dies, I think, soon after the childbirth. And he's like, you know, he has to deal with being a young father. He's thinking like, you know, what am I supposed to do now? I can't handle this kind of responsibility. But he sticks it out. Betsy Ann meets like a family friend, this barber, and he's been raising pigeons, it seems, his whole life. She becomes fascinated by these pigeons, and he gives her some pigeons as a gift. And the story takes on this like very interesting quality where, you know, it's titled The Girl Who Raised Pigeons, but even if she's like a central kind of fixation in the story, it's not just about her, right? Definitely there's a lot about her and her psychology and what she's doing, what she's up to. But a lot of it is also about Robert, the father, right? A lot of it is about his own kind of desire to protect her from, for example, pigeon deaths. It's you kind of see this kind of like, you know, youthfulness coming out again and again, where, you know, he seems to not really I don't want to say that he doesn't understand boundaries, because I mean, we don't really have much evidence of that, but he doesn't seem to truly know, being inexperienced as a father, what the boundaries ought to be in terms of what to protect his daughter from, what she's allowed to see, what she's not allowed to see. He seems to not really truly understand his daughter, like, psychologically. And I mean, that's true of like a lot of adults, right? Adults all seem to like not really get what it's like to be a kid, right? Because after you grow up, you kind of put those things behind you. So a lot of it ends up sort of being about him in this kind of oblique way. And I find that to be a very kind of interesting technique. Like even in the very beginning, the way that it opens. So the opening paragraph is like this. Her father would say years later that she had dreamed that part of it, that she had never gone out through the kitchen window at 2 or 3 in the morning to visit the birds. By that time in his life, he would have so many notions about himself set in concrete. And having always believed that he slept lightly, he would not want to think that a girl of 9 or 10 could walk by him at such an hour in the night without his waking and asking of the dark, "Who is it? What's the matter?" Right. So even like at the beginning, it's like this interesting kind of thing happening where like it seems to sort of be about him. It seems to be about his defense mechanisms, about his understanding of the world, and how having a daughter, having these pigeons, and having these other elements that are introduced into his life, all that stuff tends to, on the one hand, chip away at these understandings and force new understandings upon him. And then on the other hand, you have that line about how so many notions about himself set in concrete, right? He's like resisting a lot of this encroachment, right? He wants to think of himself in the way that he prefers to think of himself, right? And you see this from the very beginning. And, you know, it's a bit of a daring opening, right? And on first glance, it doesn't seem to be the case. But if you reread this after finishing the story, this interplay between the two characters, I think, is very interesting.
Yeah, no. And the way that he builds the prose is very subtle, but it's very poetic and effective. Like even little inversions, like he would ask of the dark, you know, "Who is it? What's the matter?"
Mm-hmm.
You know, instead of, you know, like, you know, a lesser author would be like, oh, he would call out, "Who is it? What's the matter?" or something. But to ask of the dark, you
Mm-hmm.
know, in the sense that like you're getting something about him as a character when you say that he asks of the dark, you know, like that he's almost acting instinctually, and yet from a you know, from a position of ignorance and not exactly knowing how to act.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and that's really what separates like a good writer from a great writer, you know, is that they, not just that they can find the inversions, but that they can find the inversions that capture something about the thing that they are writing about, you know,
Mm-hmm.
that tell you something deeper about the characters that they are trying to capture. And it's a great opening paragraph, I have to
Mm-hmm.
say. I mean,
And I mean, we could even like the because it's kind of like this it's just 2 paragraphs that open it before we get this kind of, you know, ellipsis in the passage of time. Like even that is the second part. So after he asks, "Who is it? What's the matter?" But the night visits were not dreams, and they remained forever as vivid to her as the memory of the way the pigeons' iridescent necklaces flirted with light. Right? I mean, yeah, just like great description. The visits
yeah.
would begin not with any compulsion in her sleeping mind to visit, but with the simple need to pee or to get a drink of water. In the dark, she went barefoot out of her room, past her father in the front room conversing in his sleep, across the kitchen and through the kitchen window, out over the roof a few steps to the coop. It could be winter, it could be summer, but the most she ever got was something she called pigeon silence. Sometimes she had the urge to unlatch the door and go into the coop, or at the very least, to try to reach through the wire and the wooden slats to stroke a wing or a breast, to share whatever the silence seemed to conceal. But she always kept her hands to herself, and after a few minutes, as if relieved, she would go back to her bed and visit the birds again and sleep.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like we start with this kind of sleep, like we end with this kind of sleep. We have these like, you know, almost like phantoms, like visiting and departing, right? And she kind of becomes a part of this process. I mean, yeah, it's a great kind of opening, and you get so many directions that this could potentially go, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, he plays a lot with time in this book, where he will give an aside about a character years later
Yeah.
that tells you something about their actions and their perspective in the current time, but you kind of have to build that connective tissue yourself in your own mind. You have to take what they say about the character. They'll be like, oh, 5 years from now, this person will blah, blah, blah. And you then have to sort of read that back into what they are doing or saying in the current moment, and figure out how that tells you, like how that then inflects your interpretation of what the character is doing in the moment that the story is describing. It's a very, I mean, it's just a subtle book. The last book that you and I talked about, Cat's Cradle, it's a great book, but it's not exactly subtle. It's very bombastic in the way that it treats the subjects that it talks about. And it's great because Kurt Vonnegut was a great author. This is someone writing their first published book of short stories. I don't know if it was something psychological where he felt like he had to be a little more understated, or if it's just like pure artistic instinct that was driving this person. But it's a lot, it's a book that requires a certain amount of engagement from the reader. It requires you to sort of figure out what are the connections between the things that it is describing and, certain other things that it describes a little bit more shallowly or obliquely, and that's not used enough in writing, or if it's used in a paradoxically showy way. Like, look how great of an author I am that I can seed all these clues throughout the texts or whatever. Like, he just writes it, and if you catch it, you catch it. If you don't, you don't. It's not specifically necessary to appreciating it, but it certainly enriches it if you engage it on that level.
Yeah. And the thing about subtlety is, like, you always like subtlety in the hands of the wrong author, right? You could easily like shift from understatement to like not saying enough, not giving enough clues, leaving too much to the human brain to sort of process and imbue it. I mean, that should be like, some of that should always be going on, but you need to make sure that you have enough clues, right, where you could actually point to like evidence in the text for a subtle reading, as opposed to one that is simply undeveloped, right? That is a fine line that is not often talked enough about.
To speak more concretely on that, a lot of classic Sherlock Holmes stories, they were built on concrete things that were in the text, that if you were reading it and you were trying to get in the headspace of the main character, you could figure out the story or the underlying crime in the same way that Sherlock, the main character, does, if you were really paying attention and thinking about it. Whereas a lot of more contemporary Sherlock Holmes adaptations, they are very clever, or they're very obtuse in the way that they depict the crime that is happening, to where only some kind of super genius like Sherlock Holmes could have figured it out, instead of seeding the clues throughout the text in a way that the audience can, if you're just reading it, you want to be surprised. You want to sort of have that aha moment where he describes everything that happened in the end. But if you really read closely, you could come to the same conclusions that he did, and that's something a lot of authors really don't get, when they're trying to create something that is subtle or that requires some kind of audience participation. It's like they don't include enough to where it's really just like stochastic. If you are somehow occupying the same headspace as the author was when they were writing the book, maybe you will happen upon the same interpretation of the text that they're writing. that they were, that they had in their head when they were writing it. But that's not a credit to the author. It's just like, oh, randomly someone was thinking the same way about the same kind of material as the person that was writing it. And that's a really difficult line to ride as an author. That is probably the hardest aspect of writing, to try to explain to young writers when you're trying to say, like, you want to give the reader enough to build a bridge to what you were thinking and feeling and experiencing when you were writing it, but you don't want to be overly obvious about it. They're either going to be too obvious or they're going to be too obtuse. And in most of this book, he perfectly straddles the line, where he gives you just enough to sort of figure out what is going on and what is the way that you should be thinking about this. But he's not like ham-fisted or overly obvious in the way that he engages with it.
Yeah. And speaking of, going back and forth in time, like the sequence in this story is we start with the pigeon coop, right? The pigeons are already in her possession. Then we get to moments before that where Robert did not want to have her get these pigeons. And so this is how this kind of subtle conflict between himself and the daughter is presented. This is on page 4. For years after he relented, Robert Morgan would rise every morning before his daughter, go out onto the roof, and peer into the coop he had constructed for her, looking for dead pigeons. At such a time in the morning, there would be only fragments of first light, falling in long, hopeful slivers over the birds in their house. Sometimes he would stare absently into the coop for a long time, because being half asleep, his mind would forget why he was there. The murmuring pigeons, as they did with most of the world, would stare back, with looks more of curiosity than of fear or anticipation or welcome. He thought that by getting there in the morning before his daughter, he could spare her the sight and pain of any dead birds. His plan had always been to put any dead birds he found into a burlap sack, take them down to his taxi cab, and dispose of them on his way to work. He never intended to tell her about such birds, and it never occurred to him that she would know every pigeon in the coop and would wonder, perhaps even worry, about a missing bird. So you get a few things here, like in the most kind of superficial sense, just like in the Woody Allen movie Radio Days, you have this sort of unexpected visit in a taxi cab, where the kid realizes finally what his dad does for a living. I don't think his work is really mentioned until you get to this point, right? So you get this just tiny detail about what he does for a living. Then you have the pigeons themselves that are they would just stare back with looks more of curiosity than of fear or anticipation. And that kind of actually parallels what his daughter is like, right? She's curious about the world. She's not very fearful, right? She's not very, she's not trying to avoid these kinds of situations that Robert is trying to prevent her from seeing. In fact, one of the most surprising twists in the story is a few pages down the line, you get to see Betsy Ann for the first time, not around her father, not around adults where she's very well behaved, but specifically around some kid. And she's kind of bullying. She's kind of loud and obnoxious. And right away that, hey, she's a lot more confident. She's a lot more aware of the world than her father gives her credit for. And it's not done in this kind of ham-fisted way where but actually, she felt this way or that way. All you get is just her interactions with this kid. And you get to see the contrast with her father, or her interactions with the barber and others, right? So, just a lot happens in any of these paragraphs where just so much is revealed in so little space. And you can miss it easily if you're, reading, for example, only once, or you're just not paying attention.
Yeah. Well, it gives you a really clean and direct insight into the mental state of a lot of these people. His wife died of brain cancer, when he was 19. Mm-hmm. That's gonna, he was very young when all this, when his life started, basically, the path that he was locked into for basically the rest of his life was set on him from a very early age. So, of course, he's going to have this kind of perspective. Of course, he's going to try to spare his daughter the horrors of the world and also run her life in a way where she is not going to die young the way that his wife did.
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
I mean, you can't control cancer, but you can control everything else in a person's life. And yet he is completely oblivious. Like the fact that he engages with the world on this level makes him completely oblivious to who his daughter is as a person, because the story also makes clear at a later point that she is fully aware that he is getting up early to look at the pigeons every day.
Yeah.
Because she wakes up randomly in the middle of the night, just like he does. You know, I mean, that's a subtle parallel between the two of them, where you can see that they are more similar to each other than they perhaps would like to admit, that they kind of wake up randomly in the middle of the night and just kind of want to wander the world. But she says to a person at a later point, oh, yeah, he just gets up and looks at the pigeons in the early morning sometimes. I don't really know why he does that, but I just see him out of the window with his flashlight looking at the pigeons. You know, so she's not like, whatever his attempts to shelter her, she is not oblivious to that. And in fact, the sort of slightly rebellious attitude that she subtly has to it is probably directly a product of the fact that she is so aware of the fact that he is trying to coddle her and shelter her and keep her apart from the horrors of the world. And it's, man, it's good.
Yeah, yeah, and speaking on that, I mean, this touches on some other themes and developments in the story. So, like, you know, his wife early on dies of brain cancer, right? And he can't control that, but now maybe he's going to try to control his environment. And you start seeing these, like, so Lost in the City, right? The city that we're talking about in the novel is Washington, D.C., right? All this takes place in D.C. And early on, when the daughter's born, I forget who he's having this conversation with, but she tells him, "Don't worry about it. It's going to be all right. The city people are good people. They're going to help you, right?" And by that, what is meant is the city government, right? That you know, there are people out there that could, you know, whether it's like some sort of, you know, food stamp program, or maybe they're going to offer some support in some other way to, like, you know, young parents or whatever. And, you know, but you get the sense throughout the story that this is a little bit double-edged, right? Just like in Bruce Ario's novel City Boy, you know, the city has like different functions. It's something that could, you know, sort of contain you and help you, give you solace of some sort. But it could also, you know, stifle you, could also hurt you, right? You have to be careful around it. And, you know, and also in this story, right, you have these things that you can't control. Then you have maybe some people that wish to help you. But then later on, this thing keeps coming up where, like, there's these rumors of like a railroad, right, coming to various neighborhoods and the neighborhood that they're living in, and that their apartment might be sold or demolished or whatever. And the kids like bully one another, like, "Oh, I hear the railroad is coming for your neighborhood. It's going to destroy your house, but my house is fine." So there's definitely this sense throughout the book, especially like with different stories here, where people have like more desperate situations in some tales. You know, the city is also kind of threatening in that way, right? And I was just going to ask, like, what do you think of that, like as a metaphor in the text, like this kind of like, you know, railroad that's kind of coming out of nowhere, like we don't know who's responsible. Like, we don't know exactly what it is, but we know that no one is going to protect you from that. No city person is going to tell you your house is fine. We're going to save you. There is this kind of overwhelming force that will be there, right? And, you know, and in some senses, like we mentioned early on, that this is a book that is like oftentimes, if not mostly, about Black or otherwise non-white characters. And yeah, this, like, race is not really explicitly mentioned in this story, but this is one of the proxies for race that you could talk about in this story, right? This kind of like out of control thing that's going to come and gobble up your apartment, right? If you're not careful, or just if you're unlucky. That itself is a kind of proxy for race. Like you could sort of touch upon the logic and the realities of race without necessarily making it the thing in the story, right? It's still kind of implied. I'm not sure if you have any comments on that or whatever.
No, it's not a novel with like, or sorry, it's not a short story collection with a super strong like thematic unity between all of the different works. You know, I mean, it's more like there are subtle through lines that are interwoven throughout it. And one of them is an intense skepticism toward bureaucracy, you know, toward things that are larger than the neighborhood or the family or the kind of intense interpersonal connections that people feel toward one another. You know, whether it's in a later story where the old woman is intensely paranoid that her social security is going to get taken away if she doesn't do and say the right things, or in this one where the omnipresent threat of the railroad is kind of constantly weighing on this child's imagination and her ability to really connect with her environment and surroundings, and the adults too, you know, or even in the next story, the first day, the bureaucracy involved with schooling, you know, with this woman who goes to a particular church and she sort of idolizes and dreams about the glories that this school that is across the street from her church, where she derives most of her meaning and her connection to her own life. And yet, because she doesn't live in the right place, her child can't go there. You know, even though this is something that is probably more connected to her on a personal or even a spiritual level, she is denied it. You know, there is a or in I think it was what is the story called, The Sunday After Mother's Day?
Yeah.
You know, this character that sort of takes a child under her wing that she identifies as kind of being similar to herself, and who ends up in a very similar situation to herself, with her mother being killed by her father, and yet the obscure and opaque bureaucracy of modern life, whether it's the actual bureaucracy of the state, or maybe just someone's family coming from the South and taking this person away, you know, like she is robbed from of this kind of connection and this ability to make right by her own flawed past and upbringing, by this thing that is larger than herself. And so that is a definite through line in this novel, is the way that sort of organic community and interpersonal ties can be impinged on and undermined and even eliminated by these forces that are larger than yourself, that
and it's often like senseless.
You can't affect in any way, you can only deal with it.
Yeah, and it's often like these like kind of like senseless losses, right, that are, you know, presented in a way where they are kind of like, you know, beyond interpretation, or if not beyond interpretation, like he oftentimes doesn't give enough evidence, right, to, like, we're going to talk about the night Rhonda Ferguson was killed. Like there's no actual stated reason for why, you know, Rhonda gets murdered by the father of her child. It just sort of happens, right? We don't have a reason why, you know, why Robert's wife dies of cancer at such an early age. And also, we don't necessarily have a reason for going to the end of the story. At the very end, basically, like the pigeon coop gets invaded, I think, by some rats, and a bunch of pigeons just get killed, right? And the father has to come out and this time truly protect her daughter, right, in a way that does make sense, right? It's as if like he was sort of preparing for this moment, like rehearsing as a father. And finally, like, you know, he wakes up one morning and he sees that, all these pigeons have been killed by these rats or whatever. He doesn't see the rats, but this is the assumption. He takes like a burlap sack and he throws them all in. She tries to come out and see. He says like, no, you cannot wash this. You have to like go to your room or whatever. And this is the way that the story ends on page 23. She missed them more than ever she thought she would. In school, her mind would wander and she would doodle so many pigeons on the backs of her hands and along her arms that teachers called her nasty, nasty girl. In the bathtub at night, she would cry to have to wash them off. And as she slept, missing them would take shape and lean down over her bed and wake her just enough to get her to understand a whisper that told her all over again how much she missed them. And when she raged in her sleep, Robert would come in and hold her until she returned to peace. He would sit in a chair beside her bed for the rest of the night, for her rages usually came about 4 a.m, and with the night so near morning, he saw no use in going back to bed. So there's more after that, but this is kind of like the general idea, right? Like the father finally gets kind of like his place, right? Where he is needed, right? He is able to comfort her in ways that she doesn't expect that she would need. And finally it happens that's, this is like a childhood loss that she's experiencing. There's no actual reason. It's simply one of those things that happened. And again, like one of those things that we could say in its own kind of limited way could be a kind of proxy for race without having to, make that so explicit or without having to focus on race itself.
Yeah. Well, I also, in terms of the race issue, one thing that I thought is very subtle, but is very clever is, there's the old stereotype that pigeons are just rats with wings.
Mm-hmm.
They're just these pests, these things that you kind of wish weren't around. Mm-hmm. And yet like the actual rats, are the things that ultimately are what destroy them. Mm-hmm. And as you read throughout the book, there's a lot of characters that feel intense resentment and mistrust of white people. I mean, mm-hmm. in the story of the store, the person, the main character specifically refers to the jobs that he has working for white people as slaves. Mm-hmm. Which is not uncommon parlance, but, the mm-hmm. fact that he chose to adopt it tells you something about him as a person. But, the sort of the dichotomy between these, very sweet and ultimately kind of harmless things, these pigeons, and he's actually like vicious pests of these rats, I think is like a sort of subtle commentary on like the vagaries of race and racial classification and categorization. That it's done very well. The idea that like ultimately these things are all considered pests, but there is a real difference between them, and the illusion of that difference is a huge loss in terms of understanding and appreciation.
Yeah. And I think artistically, this is kind of, I'm not sure if this is just like, random with me, but when I think of like artistic representations of, people that raise pigeons or, in the media or whatever, I'm wondering if like it's like a little bit of a black trope in some way. I mean, we have like Mike Tyson, right, who famously grew up raising pigeons, and one of the ways he wanted to get revenge on the world was, people would sometimes come by, harass, or sometimes even like kill his pigeons, and that was one of his kind of like defense mechanisms. We have, in this story, right, these are I think based on kind of like their milieu, based on the people they're around, it seems like they are a black family, right? And she's raising pigeons. We have that movie Ghost Dog with Forrest Whitaker, right, who plays this assassin, and he like raises pigeons on a coop. And the only other like representations of that I think in the white world is like the pigeon lady in Home Alone 2. I don't know who else, or maybe like the pigeon man in Hey Arnold or something. But everybody there is so ethnically ambiguous anyway, so you can't even say that's white.
Yeah. Well, I do think this is an overused term in criticism now, but it is a little bit like black coded, I
Yeah.
guess, but what I think it is, it's like, if you live in kind of an urban milieu and you see these pigeons around everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have any kind of other avenue of escape from the situation that you find yourself in, like the idea of raising pigeons is sort of like the absolute embrace of your circumstances. It's finding personal meaning and connection with something that any outside observer would look at and say is like a pest problem that you have, or a dirty thing that you have to deal with as a result of your poverty and your circumstances that render you unable to escape that poverty.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's class coded and it's race coded, but because we live in America, those are kind of the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Do you want to move on to the next story, or?
Yeah, I think I mean, honestly, that story I could tell. There are so many subtleties and vicissitudes that I could probably talk about that for the whole podcast. But for the sake of the story, we should probably move on.
Well, I was planning on reading this whole story the first day. If you want to read it, you could read it too, but maybe that's too much of a burden.
No, I will read it. Let me just find it here. I have an ebook version of this, so I just need a sec here. Okay. The first day. On an otherwise unremarkable September morning, long before I learned to be ashamed of my mother, she takes my hand and we set off down New Jersey Avenue to begin my very first day of school. I am wearing a checkered like blue and green cotton dress, and scattered about these colors are bits of yellow and white and brown. My mother has uncharacteristically spent nearly an hour on my hair that morning, plaiting and replaiting so that now my scalp tingles. Whenever I turn my head quickly, my nose fills with the faint smell of Dixie Peach hair grease. The smell is somehow a soothing one now when I will reach for it time and time again before the morning ends. All the plates, each with a blue barrette near the tip and each twisted into an uncommon sturdiness, will last until I go to bed that night, something that has never happened before. My stomach is full of milk and oatmeal sweetened with brown sugar. Like everything else I have on, my pale green slip and underwear are new, the underwear having come 3 to a plastic package with a little girl on the front who appears to be dancing. Behind my ears, my mother, to stop my whining, has dabbed the stingiest bit of her gardenia perfume, the last present my father gave her before he disappeared into memory. Because I cannot smell it, I have only her word that the perfume is there. I am also wearing yellow socks trimmed with thin lines of black and white around the tops. My shoes are my greatest joy, black patent leather miracles, and when one is nicked at the toe later that morning in class, my heart will break. I am carrying a pencil sharpener, and a small 10-cent tablet with a black and white speckled cover. My mother does not believe that a girl in kindergarten needs such things, so I am taking them only because of my insistent whining and because they are presents from our neighbors, Mary Keith and Blondell Harris. Miss Mary and Miss Blondell are watching my 2 younger sisters until my mother returns. The women are as precious to me as my mother and sisters. Out playing one day, I have overheard an older child speaking to another child call Miss Mary and Miss Blondell a word that is brand new to me. This is my mother. When I say the word in fun to one of my sisters, my mother slaps me across the mouth, and the word is lost for years and years. All the way down New Jersey Avenue, the sidewalks are teeming with children. In my neighborhood, I have many friends, but I see none of them as my mother and I walk. We cross New York Avenue, we cross Pierce Street, and we cross L and K, and still I see no one who knows my name. At I Street, between New Jersey Avenue and 3rd Street, we enter Seton Elementary School, a time-worn, sad-faced building across the street from my mother's church, Mount Carmel Baptist. Just inside the front door, women out of the advertisements in ebony are greeting other parents and children. The woman who greets us has pearls thick as jumbo marbles that come down almost to her navel, and she acts as if she had known me all her life, touching my shoulder, cupping her hand under my chin. She is enveloped in a perfume that I only know is not gardenia. When, in answer to her question, my mother tells her that we live at 1227 New Jersey Avenue, the woman first seems to be picturing in her head where we live. Then she shakes her head and says that we are at the wrong school, that we should be at Walker Jones. My mother shakes her head vigorously. I want her to go here, my mother says. If I'd have wanted her to go someplace else, I'd have took her there. The woman continues to act as if she had known me all my life, but she tells my mother that we live beyond the area that Seton serves. My mother is not convinced, and for several more minutes, she questions the woman about why I cannot attend Seton. For as many Sundays as I can remember, perhaps even Sundays when I was in her womb, my mother had pointed across I Street to Seton as we come and go to Mount Carmel. You're going to go there and learn about the whole world. But one of the guardians of that place is saying no and no again. I am learning this about my mother. The higher up on the scale of respectability a person is, and teachers are rather high up in her eyes, the less she is liable to let them push her around. But finally, I see in her eyes the closing gate, and she takes my hand and we leave the building. On the steps, she stops as people move past us on either side. Mama, I can't go to school? She says nothing at first, then takes my hand again, and we are down the steps quickly and nearing New Jersey Avenue before I can blink. This is my mother. She says, one monkey don't stop, no show. Walker Jones is a larger, newer school, and I immediately like it because of that. But it is not across the street from my mother's church, her rock, one of her connections to God, and I sense her doubts as she absently rubs her thumb over the back of her hand. We find our way to the crowded auditorium where gray metal chairs are set up in the middle of the room. Along the wall to the left are tables and other chairs. Every chair seems occupied by a child or adult. Somewhere in the room, a child is crying, a cry that rises above the buzz talk of so many people. Strewn about the floor are dozens and dozens of pieces of white paper, and people are walking over them without any thought of picking them up. Seeing this lack of concern, I am all of a sudden afraid. Is this where they register for school? My mother asks a woman at one of the tables. The woman looks up slowly as if she has heard this question once too often. She nods. She is tiny, almost as small as the girl standing beside her. The woman's hair is set in a mass of curlers, and all of those curlers are made of paper money. Here a dollar bill, there a $5 bill. The girl's hair is arrayed in curls, but some of them are beginning to droop. This makes me happy. On the table beside the woman's pocketbook is a large notebook, worthy of someone in high school. And looking at me looking at the notebook, the girl places her hand possessively on it. In her other hand, she holds several pencils with thick crowns of additional erasers. These the forms you got to use? My mother asked the woman, picking up a few pieces of paper from the table. Is this what you have to fill out? The woman tells her yes, but that she needs to fill out only one. I see, my mother says, looking about the room. Then, would you help me with this form? That is, if you don't mind. The woman asks my mother what she needs. This form. Would you mind helping me fill it out? The woman still seems not to understand. I can't read it. I don't know how to read or write, and I'm asking you to help me. My mother looks at me, then looks away. I know almost all of her looks, but this one is brand new to me. Would you help me then? The woman says, why, sure, and suddenly she appears happier, so much more satisfied with everything. She finishes the form for her daughter, and my mother and I step aside to wait for her. We find 2 chairs nearby and sit. My mother is now diseased, according to the girl's eyes, and until the moment her mother takes her and the form to the front of the auditorium, the girl never stops looking at my mother. I stare back at her. Don't stare, my mother says to me. You know better than that. Another woman out of the ebony ads takes the woman's child away. Now, the woman says upon returning, let's see what we can do for you two. My mother answers the questions the woman reads off the form. They start with my last name and then on to the first and middle names. This is school, I think. This is going to school. My mother enunciates each word of my name. This is my mother. As the questions goes on, she takes from her pocketbook document after document, as if they will support my right to attend school, as if she has been saving them up for just this moment. Indeed, she takes out more papers than I have ever seen her do in other places. my birth certificate, my baptismal record, a doctor's letter concerning my recent bout with chickenpox, rent receipts, records of immunization, a letter about our public assistance payments, even our marriage license. Every single paper that has anything even remotely to do with my 5-year-old life. Few of the papers are needed here, but it does not matter, and my mother continues to pull out the documents with the purposefulness of a magician pulling out a long string of scarves. She has learned that money is the beginning and end of everything in this world, and then when the woman finishes, my mother offers her 50 cents, and the woman accepts it without hesitation. My mother and I are just about the last parent and child in the room. My mother presents the form to a woman sitting in front of the stage, and the woman looks at it and writes something on a white card, which she gives to my mother. Before long, the woman who has taken the girl with the drooping curls appears from behind us, speaks to the sitting woman, and introduces herself to my mother and me. She is to be my teacher, she tells my mother. My mother stares. We go into the hall where my mother kneels down to me. Her lips are quivering. I'll be back to pick you up at 12 o'clock. I don't want you to go nowhere. You just wait right here and listen to every word she say. I touch her lips and press them together. It is an old, old game between us. She puts my hand down at my side, which is not part of the game. She stands and looks a second at the teacher, then she turns and walks away. I can see where she has darned one of her socks the night before. Her shoes make loud sounds in the hall. She passes through the doors, and I can still hear the loud sounds of her shoes. And even when the teacher turns me toward the classrooms and I hear what must be the singing and talking of all the children in the world, I can still hear my mother's footsteps above it all.
Yeah, so this is like the shortest story, I believe, in this collection. I think it's also the most famous one. In fact, I remember having to read the story and answer questions about it for the SATs in high school. And
I took the ACTs. We were not so privileged as to read Edward P. Jones.
I also read The Remains of the Day, an excerpt of The Remains of the Day.
That's a great book. We should do one on that one sometime.
Yeah, actually we should. That's that's the novel that got me into like, can I write a novel? Is it a possibility? Right. That's so definitely something to talk about. But I mean, anyway, I mean, this is such a great story. It's very short, and by being so condensed, you get tons of poetry that is both like, actual poeticisms and also poeticisms by like way of like total understatement. Like, near the end, for example, in the last paragraph, when this girl is going into the kind of like, it's not the adult world, but it's the first kind of step towards adulthood, right? A new world. And she's used to playing this, like, this game, right, with her mother. I touch her lips and press them together. It is an old, old game between us. She puts my hand down on my side, which is not part of the game, right? Because this is supposed to be a serious moment for the child. And she's trying to impress upon her that this is going to be a serious moment going forward. And the story just like straddles this line very nicely of, on the one hand, it's just like a great, like, child's point of view, like how a child would view things. Like for example, like all these like papers coming out, like magicians, like you're pulling scarves out of a hat or something. This is the way that a child would look at it, but it's also kind of, it's also reality in the sense that if you're an illiterate mother, and if you're Black, let's say this is like in the 50s or 60s taking place, you already are going to be very wary of the world. You're going to be wary of what might happen to your daughter, right? So you will come, overly prepared, perhaps with tons and tons of documents. And your child viewing this would kind of like use this kind of metaphor, right? But on the other hand, besides being like a great child's point of view, it also straddles the line between childhood and adulthood, because there's clearly, an over voice of adulthood as well, right? I mean, the first line, right? On an otherwise unremarkable September morning, long before I learned to be ashamed of my mother, she takes my hand and we set off down New Jersey Avenue to begin my first day of school. this gives you like characterization of her as an adult, or perhaps her like as a teenager. Maybe as an adult, she looks back on her, shame over her mother as like something to be ashamed of herself, right? That she shouldn't feel this way, right? My mother is great. She's protective. Look at all these wonderful things that she's doing for me. So it just kind of like, weaves in and out of like childhood and that point of view in adulthood. And it just does it just incredibly well. There's so many like quotable, memorable lines. Like another example of like the way that a child might think is when she's looking at these pencils, right? This other child has. In her other hand, she holds several pencils with thick crowns of additional erasers. Like I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I loved getting like nice fucking pencils or like nice pens, like especially when those like mechanical pens started coming out with like the multiple, like sometimes you would press down, you get a blue, you get a green, you get a yellow, like these different kinds of inks. And this is exactly how a kid would interpret this, like thick crowns.
Well, especially the, right? I always remember, I never got the erasers that fit over the top of the pencil, they're shaped like something.
Yeah.
That was not that I couldn't afford it. It just wasn't a part of my, my cultural expression or whatever. But I remember always being impressed by those when other kids had them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like, it's just this nice kind of like, interplay between both points of view. And also like, like a subtle little like comment. I mean, like, so it's like when she says finally that she can't read, right? I don't know how to read and write. First of all, you get exactly why she as a kind of like, maybe teenager, adolescent might start to be ashamed of her mother, right? This is like the first kind of set of details that really kind of like let you know why. I mean, but this also clearly speaks to race. I mean, if you look in the 50s and 60s, I'm sure that the majority of people that could not read, right, they weren't white people, right? They had to be natives, they had to be Hispanics, right? They had to be immigrants of some sort, or they had to be Black people, right? This is so that you get a subtle racial comment there.
Well, it's also a class comment as well.
I mean, class comment too. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like intra-racial class conflict.
Yeah.
Which is subtly interwoven into the story. You have to assume that, this was before like, all these programs that like get white people into all these inner city schools, like probably most of these teachers are people that are, somewhat from the community, or at least like adjacent communities like Virginia or Maryland or something like that, and they have all these curlers in their hair. One of them has a curler that actually has like money on it for whatever reason, or maybe that's her perception of it or whatever. But like the sort of dawning awareness that like, these people are like me, but they're not like me exactly. And it's put in the story, like it's in the story narratively, but it's not necessarily in the narrator's overt perception. It's something that you bring to it as someone that has knowledge of the world outside of this book. And that's because it's not a very, like, the prose itself is not necessarily childish. Like, you think of like William Blake poems or like James Emanuel poems where they use very simple and like childlike rhymes and cadences in order to capture like a child's perspective. This doesn't have that necessarily. It captures it by things that are not overtly included in it, that are outside of the narrator's awareness at the time that they're describing.
Yeah. Yeah. And also you still get the sense, right, throughout that, the mother is very kind of, fearful of, like, speaking of like loss in the city, right, and the city's encroachment. She's very fearful of what the city might pretend, what it has, right? What it might do to her family, right? There's this like really nice line, right, when she's like taking out these documents. As the questions go on, she takes from her pocketbook document after document, as if they will support my right to attend school, as if she has been saving them up for just this moment, right? Almost as if like, although we have like, compulsory education at this point in America, she still is not trustful of the idea that her child can be allowed into the school. But then on the other hand, right, she says that as you go higher and higher up in this kind of, scale of respectability, she has to be kind of, aggressive with them, right? She has to push back. She has to not allow herself to be bullied by this world, because this is the only way that you could survive, right? In the intersection of class and race, in this story and other stories, and in this world.
It's an empathy building story as well, because the ending of it with the child watching her mother walk away, and all of the the play and the chatter of the children is like completely drowned out by the sound of her mother's footsteps in the hallway. I mean, you have to imagine that this mother was like wearing heels.
Yeah.
Like she dressed up to come bring her child to school. And I think, especially like, as two white guys or whatever, or two not like abjectly poor people in our lives, we've all seen someone like at a function or in public that is like way overdressed for it. And your initial thing is to be like, oh, that person is clueless. They don't know what is going on. But, they might have a very good reason for thinking that is something that they need to do.
Yeah.
Like not everybody is like a white hipster that is doing it for attention. Like some people are just operating from like different understandings and parameters than you are. I mean, it's a subtle but good example of how, art can't really change anything in the world writ large, but it can certainly help to hone and improve your understanding of like the small scale things that happen in your life, like someone that comes to a function way overdressed for what it is. And, maybe there is something about them or their life that made them do that,
Yeah.
It's nice.
Yeah. I mean, I've often said to myself that one of the reasons why I got into art and specifically films was, I wanted like a better understanding of myself. Specifically, why am I getting in all these fucked up relationships again and again and again, as a teenager or whatever. So, that's definitely something that it could do for you, right? If you are, if you're open to such. Anyway, I mean, it's a great story, and probably my favorite within here. Maybe as I take a drink of water, maybe you could start off with maybe say something about the night Rhonda Ferguson was killed, which is the next story. I'm going to put myself on mute as I do this, so you can't hear my disgusting gargle.
Well, everyone loves mouth sounds. What are you talking about? So the night Rhonda Ferguson was killed is a story about a character named Cassandra Lewis, who is kind of, I don't know what you would call it, like a bit of an itinerant child, a homeless child. Her parents have died for reasons that are unspecified in the story. They have died, and so she sort of floats between different people's couches. Essentially, she spends a lot of time on her sister and brother-in-law's house. She spends time with the titular character, Rhonda Ferguson. That's kind of her surrogate family. That's the family that has most closely adopted her as a member. And she seems to just sort of float between different milieus, because ultimately, talking about the notion of the city and these larger structures that do or do not capture people. She's a minor and her parents have died, but she has not attritioned into anything. She has not been absorbed into anything. She is left essentially to fend for herself. And so this has made her into a rather kind of a bitter and mean character in a lot of ways. I mean, of the protagonists in the book, she's probably the one that is the closest to like a bully. There's another character in the book that she is sort of constantly, the modern term we would use is like slut shaming. She is constantly making cracks about the fact that she is constantly floating between relationships and talking about how this latest person that she has found is the love of her life and somebody that, is going to save her from her situation. And she makes a crack like, there's all these women that they open their legs for whatever dick is around, and that's you, and she clearly has like resentment toward this person because of that. You don't exactly know what are the things that have happened in her personal life that make her resentful toward that kind of way of being specifically, but
you get a little bit of that. I mean, like the opening sentence talks about her being like made fun of as like a Mack truck, right? Like, so she's fat, and like you notice like some of the kind of like more extreme bullying comes out. Like there's this really maybe we could read some of this now. There's this part, right, where like her car breaks down, and like she's driving out of the front, her car breaks down, and suddenly this like a guy who's like handsome and tall or whatever, right, comes down and is like, hey, I could help you with that. And Cassandra is like, oh yeah, sure. And she's like very, she's very happy to get this attention. It's clear that he's giving some sort of interest in her, like romantically. She wants to see where this is going to go. And suddenly, like, some of her friends like run out of the house, and like they start screaming like some guy tried to like rape one of these girls, and she starts like fighting some kid, thinking that he's the one to try to rape her. And suddenly, this let's call it very masculine behavior seems to really turn off this guy who's like presented as a kind of like Southern gentleman, right? Stone Cold Bama is the way that he's described. And so after this like positive interaction where we think like, wow, like, perhaps maybe something nice might happen. Maybe she'll get like a nice date or something out of this. The way that it ends is like, I don't give 3 fucks who he is, Cassandra said about like the kid that potentially assaulted someone. She began to struggle, but he held both her arms, and the more he held her, the calmer she became. Whatever had been in his eyes before Melanie screamed was there no more, and she would have given her arms to have it back. Right. And after that, right, when she gets back in the car, it starts up again. That's when she starts doing some of the more kind of extreme bullying, right? She says, Cassandra said, I'm fucking tired of all your talk about somebody being cute all the time. You get on my nerves with that shit. You sound like a damn cuckoo clock with just one tune, right? And then she keeps going on and on about this. And, it's not a coincidence that, she herself was trying to do that very same thing that she's accusing her friends, right, of doing now.
Well, and it's kind of a realistic detail that this kind of handsome Southern gentleman or whatever is like interested in her, just on the basis that, that he comes from the South, probably there's not a lot of small women that he dealt with in his day-to-day life, the land of soul food and fried food and sweet tea and shit like that, like he is probably used to, like, in Washington, D.C., in this urban milieu where probably food is not as common to come. I mean, we're so divorced from this now, the idea that like food is like a scarce resource, in the wake of the 1970s and Richard Nixon essentially declaring that like food is never going to be an issue in a presidential election again, if he has anything to say about it. We're very divorced from that, but probably most of the people in this town, I mean, probably on average, there's more overweight and obese people in the Black community, but on average, people were skinnier back then, especially in cities where people where there was more competition, for that kind of thing. And so the fact that she is, kind of a bigger girl based on the textual evidence makes her more of an outcast than it would now in either America or the Black community writ large. But that's something that he's probably more used to. And so he intrinsically sees like the sort of, like sassy, sarcastic, like the likable aspects of her that come out when she first meets him. Like he is someone that is primed to see her more as a person than as like a figure of ridicule or something like that. But she then fails to conform to probably what he also expects, which is a slightly more feminine affect to someone, kind of a more like passive or nurturing nature. And so he's kind of turned off immediately because that is not the kind of woman that he probably grew up around, So yeah. It's very, 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 I mean, it's easy to spam the word subtle in this conversation, but it's all happening under the surface of the text. But if you kind of sit back and think about it, like it's perfectly logical. And it's also perfectly logical that this would be something that would really set her off and reveal kind of the uglier side of her, because even the few fleeting glimpses that she has of a better life where she's treated by people with more dignity and humanity, like are ripped from her when the things that she doesn't have control over, like the sort of bitter, aggressive aspect of herself that exists in response to the rather abject circumstances that she has found herself in, come out. That's not something that she probably has conscious control over. It's like an instinctive, natural response to the life that she's lived. And yet it fundamentally severs her from someone that might be able to appreciate her, for who she is outside of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we should probably talk about like the title character, Rhonda Ferguson, who's she's like a locally famous, it seems like teenage or perhaps even like early 20s singer. She seems to be like on the verge of signing some sort of lucrative contract, and she's actually friends with Cassandra, and she constantly tells her stuff like, Cassandra's always like teasing her, like, oh, when you get famous, you'll completely forget about me, in this kind of like self-deprecating way. And she's like, no, I'll always, come back, and I'm going to take you guys with me, so on and so forth. And I mean, she's like an interesting feature because, like it's something that, it's essentially kind of like a casino, right? Where you have to be born with certain genetic gifts to be a singer in most cases. You have to have like enough luck in your life where you could sort of come out of it at the other end where you could become a singer. And it kind of represents this kind of like, impossible attainment for most of the characters within, because I mean, most of the time that we see Cassandra riding around with friends, they're just kind of, they're yelling at each other, or she's like skipping school, or you see her like in situations where she's homeless, and not truly able to understand herself or her life. And near the end of the story, quite suddenly, without explanation, Rhonda Ferguson gets killed by Jeffrey, who is the father of her child. And there's no reason that's ever given, right? I mean, it's one of those things like with the railroad in the first story, and other things that happen later stories. It's just like this force of nature that comes and it sort of damages you, right? And it has a lot to do with class. It has things to do with race, but it doesn't have to be made so explicit, right? And like the death is described very interestingly, right? You have, for example, white cops that are standing around and they're trying to like, the line is something like, they seem to be aware of the fact that they will never be involved in something as important as this moment, right? Where they're trying to keep people away from the scene of a murder. Perhaps they will never have to deal with such a thing ever again. So after Rhonda gets killed, this is how it's described. A woman next to Anita's mother said, "He just shot her for no reason at all. I was playing out there with my grandbaby, and I could see her practicing in the basement." Cassandra stepped toward the policeman with the folded arms, and one told her, "Get back, get back." "He shot her and then just came out here and sat down on the steps," the woman said, "like he was waiting for a ride to come pick him up." Rhonda's father was a very thrifty man, and had he been there, Cassandra knew, had his daughter been in the basement alive and practicing, all those lights would not have been on. Right. And again, like, that's a nice little detail, right?
Well,
it tells you a
that's the
lot.
kind of detail that most writers miss.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like the denial that she engages with in first,
Yeah.
and then just a small, seemingly trivial detail that like pulls this person back to reality.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like, oh no, like of course these cops would not be standing outside of this house if
Yeah.
everything was hunky-dory, but like that aspect, you know, doesn't sink in. It's the fact that something about your life as you experience it is suddenly different.
Yeah. Yeah.
and
And
and,
it's a
and that,
detail that only you would know, right? The cops would
yeah.
never know this detail about the father, about the fact that, oh, those lights would not be on. But you, right? This being the extent of your world, the extent of your reality, you know that. And since that has changed, since that is somehow out of place, right? You have to come to terms with that reality here.
One, I just want to check one thing. Yeah, what's weird is I had in my head, because I guess the '90s are just kind of a blur to me because I was a
Yeah.
child during them. That this, like, one the thing that is like kind of the real, you know, it's sad that Rhonda Ferguson is killed, but the underlying tragedy of this is not that she's killed; it's that the people that live like this, they have to pin their hopes on these people that win the lottery, as you say.
Yeah.
You know, they have to live vicariously through these few people that sort of slip through the cracks of racial and economic oppression, and find some kind of success outside of this milieu that they are raised in. And this is released in like '92. I had in my head that like this was around the time of the OJ trial, but that was actually a few years later. But you sort of saw the same phenomenon at work, you know, like this almost presaged like that, where, you know, OJ was like this, you know, this nice black guy that made good, you know, on his natural God-given talents.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though pretty clearly he was a murderer, like ultimately enough people have like had their lives ruined not being a criminal or being only a very petty criminal, that if he can sort of bite back against that system
Mm-hmm.
and point out that like you have no basis on which to judge me, you have no basis on which to say that I'm guilty of anything, because you are guilty of something far more odious and evil than my stabbing my bitch ex-wife and her lover.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like even though on some level it's like evil to look at that and revel in it and say like, oh, he's innocent, oh, he's actually a great man. Like, it's wrong to do that, but you fundamentally understand like the impulse.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you understand why something like that could happen, because like, what the fuck else do these people have to look forward to? What do these people have to live through other than the people that prove that like every other facet of their lives that is oppressing them wrong? You know?
Yeah, and speaking of the '90s and like pinning your hopes on, you know, essentially these lottery winners, there's that line from the rapper Juvenile, something like, if I, you know, give $1 every time I come around, I'd be broke, right? Like you can't, there's no way that you could depend on, you know, on any kind of savior in that sense, right? There needs to be some sort of, you know, systemic and systematic changes. And yet, with the way that kind of like these like de facto lottery winnings work, is it does keep, you know, tons of people in a sense a little bit of like complacency, right? Where they think, you know, that could be me, right? Whether it's like Americans who, you know, believe they are temporarily, you know, disgraced, downtrodden, fallen billionaires, or whether it's like, you know, kids in the projects thinking like, what if I could be, you know, like a great basketball player or whatever. You know, so much of so much of the process in society ends up being a way of getting people into the mentality of lottery winnings, right? As opposed to anything else, probably because very little else of substance is in fact given and made available to them.
Well, I mean, the entirety of capitalist society is essentially a lottery-based society. You know, I mean, it's basically like if you are born in the right circumstances and the right set of things happen to you, maybe you will be, you know, maybe you will innovate how you make, you know, gaskets for washing machines or something like that, but that's not something people are willing to deal with. And so they have to, affect these fictions of like, oh no, it's actually merit that is the reason that this happened. And the sort of, I would say a lot of this book you could describe as, what Marx might call like the lumpen proletariat or whatever, or the unclass conscious proletariat. It's people that don't really have a sense of like what are the larger structural forces at work in their life exactly, except race, which they all understand perfectly. Maybe too perfectly, but I mean, they all understand that, but the larger mechanisms that make that salient are not exactly something that is lucid to them. And so they're sort of left making sense of the detritus of their lives absent that larger understanding.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, well, I just want to finish the story with like the last couple of paragraphs because they're very nice. If you want to say something before that about the story.
No, I was going to move on. So you finished the.
Yeah, let's just because we didn't really read much from here too much, just to give you a sense of how this ends. Anita's father and brother were playing chess at the kitchen table when they came in. Anita and her mother took Cassandra into the girls' room. Cassandra sat on the bed with her hands in her lap and looked out the window. Anita stood at the foot of the bed, one arm around the bedpost, looking down at Cassandra. An eyeless and very old teddy bear leaning back against her bedpillows had fallen over when Cassandra sat down. The ticking of the Big Ben clock Anita's grandfather had given her was the loudest sound in the room. In the kitchen, her brother was proclaiming victory over their father for only the third or fourth time in the boy's life. Beyond her window, Anita could see the twinkling lights of Washington. Anita's mother came in and gave Cassandra a cup of cocoa sitting in a saucer. I got to be going home, Cassandra whispered, saying home as if it were a foreign word. Anita told her to drink. Anita watched as her mother helped Cassandra off with her clothes and into one of her mother's nightgowns. She made a pallet for her daughter beside the bed and turned out the light when she left the room. Occasionally, Cassandra would drift into what Anita thought was sleep. All the while, Cassandra gritted her teeth. Sometime way late in the night, Cassandra spoke out, and at first Anita thought she was talking in her sleep. She asked Anita to sing that song she had sung in the car on the way home. Anita sang. Long after her parents had gone to bed, long after she stopped wondering if Cassandra was listening, Anita sang. She sang on into the night for herself alone, her voice pushing back everything she did not yet understand. Right. So it's kind of like, the music, this kind of like symbol of escape, right, that is being played out in Rhonda Ferguson is now something that's kind of internalized. You see the twinkling of Washington, right? We know that's kind of like, that's the state. That's the most powerful country on the planet at that point and still now. And yet, all you could do is just internalize the song and the symbol and try to make the best of that.
And it's very sad because she's sort of canonically the second best singer in the book, or in the story, but it's also heavily implied that nobody would ever buy a record of this woman singing, so it's like it's this thing that she is kind of good at and that she has access to, and yet it can never take her where it could have taken Rhonda Ferguson, and she's aware of that, and yet she is like fixated on it. Beautiful ending.
Yeah, indeed.
And which unfortunately leads us into, it's still a pretty good story, but I would say it's probably the weakest story of the collection, which is Young Lions.
I think it's the weakest so far. I mean, maybe there's some other ones that are kind of like a little, like an Orange Line Train to Ballston seems a little,
that one it's short though. You have to.
It's short and it's nice, right? But I feel like there's probably more individual elements in Young Lions that add up to a bit more, right? I know Dan, in his review, Dan Schneider of Cosmoetica, he said that he finds the ending to be like a bit melodramatic. and some other like flaws. And I guess some of that is true, but I probably have a higher estimation of the story than either you or him.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's more generic than other stories in the collection.
Yeah.
You know, it's more, I mean, there have been plenty of short stories about, you know, these like petty criminals going about their day. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of an anticipation. There are aspects of it that are in anticipation of like what Tarantino would do in his movies a few years later, like the character of Manny, the fencer and the sort of highest level criminal that we see in this book is not, you know, with his gaunt frame and oversized Hawaiian shirts and his bar full of pictures of people that he's had beaten up, you know, and also celebrities that have come into the bar simultaneously. Like there is something about that is sort of the like, you know, the hip, cool or like funny conception of crime that Tarantino would popularize a couple years later. Like it tells you that in some sense, Tarantino is not the innovator of this so much as he was like the lottery winner of this zeitgeist that kind of existed in the 90s as violent crime was ultimately, you know, on a multi-decade decrease and becoming less of like a visceral lived reality and more of like an abstract thing that you could kind of, you know, conceptualize and aestheticize, you know, probably Martin Scorsese did the best job of that, but this is kind of biting off of the same fruit, you know, and in that time. You know, it's a story that has a lot of admirable elements. Yeah. I mean, there are certainly paragraphs and pages that you can read and be like, oh, this is very much in the vein of what he's doing elsewhere in the book. But I think it's missing some of like the interstitia that the other stories have that really flesh it out. That make it, you know, it's just a little too pat at times, you know, and it's a little too like stuck on the aesthetic enjoyment of the criminality and away from the like deeper, subtler explorations of like the pathologies of the subaltern or the lump invention or whatever, you know, that is present in much of the rest of the book.
Yeah. One thing I'll say, like speaking to the whole kind of like Tarantino angle, I think that's accurate. I think when he talks about crime in his and also like just other stories in this book, it tends to be a bit weaker because I mean, you like there's definitely things that you know are just kind of like fanciful exaggerations or things that would never actually happen. Like in this other story that he has later on, I think it's His Mother's House is the title. Like it basically ends with this like criminal kid who's already kind of like on his way to like actual like real serious riches, has like people working for him, and he like literally like murders someone like in front of like literally like a dozen plus people, right? And that it's like that whole kind of Tarantino slash Sopranos angle with like you know, Tony Soprano like mowing people down with his fucking car like in the parking lot in front of like, you know, all these people like watching it as if that would ever actually happen like in a mafia setting or you know,
in defense of that show, it did get better about that in later seasons, but that's the whole, you know, I mean, that's what I said. It's like it's the kind of thing that exists because there is a cultural fascination with the abstract idea of crime, and in some ways that's like naturally what you would expect to happen, you know, as some of the seedier aspects of a capitalist society, as it learns to kind of deal with those and tamp them down, and as people get some distance from it, you know, it becomes an object of curiosity and examination rather than just like this visceral thing that you have to deal with and avoid, and that is like a real threat impinging on your day-to-day life. Yeah, you know, it's like in the 70s, the reaction to that was like Death Wish was sort of this this cultural desire to take revenge on people that have wronged you, and in the 90s, it's like, well, you know, let's see what was going on with them that made them want to do it in the first place. You know, like that's just a natural sociological outgrowth. And the one thing I'll say that's interesting is I don't know Edward P. Jones's personal life. You know, I don't know what class he grew up in. I don't know if he grew up poor, or if he was more middle class, or even part of like the black bourgeoisie or whatever. But I would imagine that he probably had about the same proximity to crime as somebody like Martin Scorsese, you know, where it was just kind of a thing that he was on the periphery of, and that he saw the effects of in his neighborhood, but it wasn't specifically something that he was a part of. But Scorsese, because he approached it from the level of his art and his engagement with film, he was sort of able to fill in that gap with his artistry in a way that I think Edward P. Jones wasn't quite able to, because gangsterism just does not translate as well into prose as it does outside of Dan's work, into prose as it does into movies and television, because the viscerality of it and the thrill that you can take in seeing people transgress these social norms it's more abstract in prose than it is in visual art.
Yeah. And I mean, just like speaking to some of the like elements that are, you know, like pretty good in this story. The way that it starts, like, so first of all, I mean, when it begins, you have no idea about any of the kind of like, you know, criminality of the lead character. And you get this kind of like slow buildup, right? So he stood naked before the open refrigerator in the darkened kitchen, downing the last of the milk in a half-gallon carton. Carol, once again, had taped a note to the carton. Caesar Matthews did not have to read it to know that it told him that she loved him with all her heart, or that she would miss him all that day. She used to pin such notes to her pillow before she went off in the morning, leaving him still asleep. But in the night, when she brushed her hair as she prepared for bed, she would find the note still pinned to the pillow, undisturbed and so perhaps unread. So now she taped them to milk cartons, for he could not begin his day without drinking milk, or she taped them to his gold key ring, or pinned them to the zippers of the expensive pants she knew he would wear that day. In more than 2 years, the wording on the notes had not changed very much. Sometimes when he thought of it, he would fold the paper with the words and place it on the kitchen table between the salt and the paper shakers to let her know he had come upon it before he ventured out. This morning, after he had finished the last of the milk, without reading the words, he tossed the carton in high arc across the room into the trash can. He pulled up the window shade and let in the morning light. He was anxious to be out in the streets. There was nothing like an empty apartment to bring down the soul. So, like, I mean, at the beginning, you just sort of think like, okay, he's just like, you know, this kind of like, you know, he's a bad boyfriend of some sort. Maybe he's using her for some purpose. You don't really get a sense necessarily of criminality, but that kind of unfolds little by little. Right. And then it comes out very starkly, you know, like some lines about like shooting someone in the face or whatever. And in other situations, but you know, it's kind of like a slow unfolding. And you also definitely get like little, like, you know, hints of a character that tends to humanize him here and like elsewhere in the story. And also like this kind of this thing that early on, like it becomes a controlling idea. He was anxious to be out in the streets. There was nothing like an empty apartment to bring down the soul, right? You get the sense all throughout that he simply cannot be around himself at any given time. He has to be around others. He has to always be doing something. And a lot of this honestly seems to, especially with the story's ending, it seems to imply that he probably does have either some level of guilt about like his life trajectory and the kind of activities he engages in, or at least perhaps not the kind of confidence that he either shows or assumes himself to have, right? Like at the very end, he starts to run away, like the rain is sort of like washing away his address book. And he generally seems like very kind of scared and also very surprised, right? And you know, like this like opening paragraph, like you think of Carol as this like pathetic girlfriend, and in some ways, at least at the beginning, she is, but by the end of the story, she definitely like does develop at least a couple of like more dimensions. It's not really, you could argue it's not sketched out enough, but she definitely experiences a character arc that shows herself to be stronger in many ways, more self-aware than Caesar, right? Like she's able to stand up for herself and her convictions and kind of like what she wants out of the world in a way that Caesar himself shows that he cannot really do, right? So he's not this kind of like, he's not like a cartoon villain in the vein of like a Tarantino villain, right? He has like some layers to him that come out, right, as the story unfolds.
It's not enough
to
make it work in the way that other stories work, but yeah, absolutely, he has dimensionality to him. What going back to the idea of like the alienating effects of bureaucracy and larger systems of control on interpersonal connection and community as sort of a running through line of this book, you could make a case that in this story, the entirety of Caesar's criminal career stems somewhat from the like cold, stentorian, bureaucratic personality of his father, like having robbed him of a sense of deep personal connection from an early point in his life. The story says at one point that his father was the kind of person that if at this time he saw him from like his office window or whatever, he would bound down the steps 3 at a time, seize him and call for a cop to come arrest him because this is the person that robbed him. And I mean, you have to assume that there is a coldness to that was that probably permeated his childhood. The mother doesn't seem to be in the picture. And
the mother actually dies, or like one of the elements like that, like one of the ways that he tries to get you to empathize with Caesar is like after like seeing all the kinds of like, disgusting things that he does, you get this like element thrown in of like him like recalling, for example, his mother dying when he was younger, or like like even it's like a little detail, but they call her the retarded woman, right? That he's sort of like scoping out to sort of steal from. When he sits at a park bench somewhat close to her, like she sits down and she starts eating these like tangerine slices, and like the wafting of the orange scent, the citrus scent goes into his nose. And it's kind of like, it's almost like, you're getting like a little bit of this kind of like physical empathy, right? That's like one of the little strokes. Like granted, I do agree that it's not really enough, especially given the length of the story. It is actually, fairly long. And you don't get as much character as you do in some of the other, equally lengthy stories. But, it's one of those things.
Yeah. Another thing that is kind of interesting is that there are elements of there's not any continuous story told through the stories, and there's not like a specific thematic or philosophical thing that he's trying to communicate consistently across every story. But there are motifs and ideas that make their way across stories. So for example, we find out that he is the character that got his hand cut by the main character of the last story. Which is something that I only realized when I reread the book, because he makes a comment, something about like, it was like that crazy old bitch that cut my hand 2 weeks ago when I tried to pilfer something from her pocket. And that was like a nothing to him, but it was everything to her. But another thing that I'm only now appreciating as we're talking about it is in the sort of canonical tale of this story, The Store. One of the things that the character Penny says to the main character in that book is that the idea of sleeping in the store is an abomination because you don't do your business and your personal life in the same place. And like there's wisdom in that lesson, and yet Caesar has no access, that's like a community wisdom that he himself somehow has no access to. And that's like the thing that kind of undoes his life as it has been constructed so far, the idea that he tries to bring his girlfriend that is just this unconnected, unattached beneficiary of crime into the world of crime itself. And yet his, like, the aggression and violence and anger that he affects when he is doing crime, he cannot keep away from his girlfriend when she is clearly distressed at this thing that she has done. And he basically, I mean, possibly, we don't know, in abusive or fucked up and toxic relationships, there's every opportunity for these things to mend themselves, even when they shouldn't. But it seems like he has like terminally alienated himself from her by the end of the story. Yeah. And, there is a slice of wisdom elsewhere in the book happening to somebody else that might have told him that is not, that he probably should not have approached this whole thing in the way that he did in the first place.
Yeah. And just speaking to this kind of end, right? So like Carol, his girlfriend, it gets like entangled in this thing that Caesar wants to do, which is like he sees like some sort of like mentally like disabled woman that he tries to like trick out of her money, right? And ultimately he does so with like, I guess, Carol's help. And he's like very concerned about the contents of her purse, and he's trying to like get the purse away from Carol, and he's trying to make sure that all the money is where it's supposed to be. And as they're like walking down the street and like arguing about this, so like he took the purse. Don't, she said, taking it back, for God's sake, don't. He slapped her and grabbed for the bag with the other hand. So this is the first time you see any kind of physical altercation. And it seems like it is the first time that he ever does anything, remotely like physically abusive towards her. It opened and everything inside fell out. Seeing the money fall to the ground, he slapped her again and she began to cry. Her nose bled and her bottom lip was split in two places and it bled as well. The bum had awakened, and seeing the woman get slapped, he asked, "What is it there with you two peoples?" Caesar dropped the purse and Carol knelt down and began putting things back in. He pulled her to her feet. "What the hell's wrong with you?" "Leave me alone. Just leave me alone." She knelt and he pulled her up again. "I said, leave me alone." He slapped her. He could now see the distance between them growing, and seeing that distance and knowing he no longer had the power to close it, he slapped her once more, which is just like, it's a very kind of believable description, right? You could definitely imagine, people in that kind of situation, like, okay, I sort of had this mask for so long. Now that I can't do that anymore, I'm just going to, embrace this nature. And since she's not of utility to me any longer, I'm going to continue in this rampage. The blow sent her back a few feet. She said, "Oh," several times, but everything sounded to him like no. She put her hand to her face and trembled. Right. And then ultimately, like, she's like demanding, like, "Okay, let's go home." She watched him stepping up to her. He took out the Beretta and held it to her cheek. "Did you hear what I said?" There was no surprise in her face, and there was no fear. He realized that if he beat her with the pistol, that too would not surprise her. And had he shot her in the face or through her heart, she would not have been surprised at that either. He pocketed the gun and stepped back. So like, in some senses, like, he was like completely emasculated by the fact that, he used to be able to intimidate people to get his way. But she at this point is not scared, as if like she figured something out, whether it's like she truly understands him now, what he's about, or something else. She undergoes like a serious change of character that it works very nicely in contrast to the fact that he ultimately experiences this kind of breakdown where he's just kind of running from himself. He's running from the street, right? And the final line is, as the rain is coming and kind of like blurring out his address book where he has nowhere to go now, he only knew that tonight would not be a night to be without shelter, right? But, he essentially has no real shelter, right? He has no place anymore, no home anymore. He has no father that is concerned with him, right? So, I mean, anyway, like, there are definitely like some really like some strong elements in the text. And as you mentioned, there's stuff in other stories that kind of, reference some of this material as well. Yeah.
So that, I mean, I guess that leads us into what I would say is pretty almost incontrovertibly the best story in the book, which is the
Yeah.
store.
Yeah.
You know, in some ways, it's the most like classic short story. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, you could argue that it's maybe not as structurally daring as certain other stories in the collection are,
Mhm.
but it's classic done well. You know, it really like it's believable. It is rich. It's textured. It's varied, and it's got a nice lesson. You know, it's like it's real. Was I forget? Was it Cicero or Horace that said art is entertainment and enlightenment? You
I don't
know,
know. I don't know.
it's it's
Sounds
that.
Roman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, it's everything that you want out of a short story. And it's not my personal favorite. I like the one about the girl who raised pigeons better, but this is the one that you really can't extricate anything from it without like weakening the story, you know.
And it's also, you know, we read a ton of stuff so far that is like directly poetic. This
Mm-hmm.
one with the narrator, right? The narrator is a protagonist, and
Mm-hmm.
um, there's far less like poeticism in the description.
Yes.
It's much more kind of like, you know, like I don't want to say it's like generic language, because I mean it can't be. With a great story, you can never be in
Mm-hmm.
a situation where like the language is generic, but the language feels very prosaic, right? It's very kind of conversational. Maybe like for example, like the way that it starts. I'd been out of work 4 months when I saw her ad in the Daily News. A few lines of nothing special, almost as if she really didn't want a response. On a different day in my life, I suppose I would have passed right over it. I had managed to squirrel away a little bit of money from the first slave I had, right? Meaning like at a period of slavery. And after that change ran out, I just bummed from friends for smokes, beer, and valuables. I lived with my mother, so rent and food weren't a problem, though my brother, when he came around with that family of his, liked to get in my shit and tell me I should be looking for another job. Usually my mother was okay, but I could tell when my brother and his flat butt wife had been around when I wasn't there. Because for days after that, my mother would talk that same shit about me getting a job like I'd never slaved a day before in my life. And I mean, it's a very interesting. I actually I've been trying to like look. Maybe I keep missing it for a name to the character. I'm just going to call him the narrator.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I don't think it's given.
yeah, it might not be given at all, right? And that itself might be sort of like telling in terms of like what maybe some of the lessons, if you want
Mm-hmm.
to be crass about it, the story are. But I mean, even this like opening paragraph, right? You get lots of interesting details about him. Like he's not a lazy person. Like he's definitely been working hard, and in fact, in the next page, he says that, you know, I am a hard worker, and I take pride in that fact. Right. Whenever I did have jobs, I did actually do what I was supposed to do. But he definitely has like elements to him where he's pulled to do sort of, let's call it the wrong thing. Right. Where he, like for example, like when he answers this ad, he's, you know, more or less offered this job. When he's supposed to show up, he kind of like fucks around, like he doesn't show up, like he just spends like, you know, the night wandering the streets, he calls it. And yet the way that it's described is, so like first of all, when he goes to ask about the job, for whatever reason, he says that he wakes up like very, very early and he couldn't like go back to sleep. Right. He just needs to wake up early, and suddenly for whatever reason he finds himself at the store. And then when he like fucks around and like skips work like the next day or something, uh like in the middle of the day he just like wanders in, right? He wanders around the city and wanders inside the store as if there is like some kind of power like pulling him in there. And part of that power, you get the sense by the story's ending, is that being a hard worker, being someone that is like essentially mature in many respects, He is kind of drawn to responsibility. He is drawn to more or less doing the right thing, even if there are bumps along the way. And it's like this interesting kind of thing where like you kind of expect him to be like a little bit of a fuck up, but instead, he is someone that definitely grows like as the story goes on.
Mhm. Well, you see it in the fact that he refers to jobs that he has had in the past as slaves.
Yeah.
And I mean, presumably he has only worked for white men or white women in the past. So he has trouble taking any kind of passion or meaning from acts that he perceives as existing only to benefit or enrich people outside of his community and outside of his like purview. He's very drawn to the stories of his father working for this undertaker and giving him the best day of work in his life. And the undertaker, and when he doesn't show up the next day, the undertaker comes to abuse him. But when he realizes, no, he's not lazy, like he intentionally didn't show up as like a fuck you to me, he tries to bargain with him and be like, no, you were great. I would love to have you back. But he'd already started working at a steel mill or a sawmill or something like that. Yeah. There's a very subtle racial element to this story, which is the idea that fundamentally work that is done for something, and again, tying back into the general themes of the book, work that is done for something abstract or outside of something that you can call like a community or a social milieu that you feel yourself to be a part of, is alienating. It's not something that you can just will yourself to want to be a part of, because there's no real personal or spiritual benefit to it. You're going to be the one that's paid the least, promoted the least. You're going to get fired first if times get bad or if something happens to the economy or the company. But he himself is not an intrinsically lazy person. He's kind of at the start of the story, he's a bit of like, the modern term is like fail son or something like that. His brother is a little more successful. He's got a family. He's a harder worker, and he chastises him. And he spends most of his time going out to dance and trying to find women to fuck and things like that. So he's in a bit of a rut. And it's kind of telling that, men who were in a rut in earlier eras, they went around and they went to parties and they danced and they fucked and they did drugs and things like that. And now they sit around and they play video games and they go on the internet. It's a sign of cultural degeneration, if ever there was one. But when he is presented with something that is challenging, but fulfilling and connected to something that is a little more deeply rooted than just a mailroom in some big faceless company or something like that, he thrives. He takes it as a personal challenge and as something that if he does it well, it means something.
Yeah. There's also this interesting element where race, probably with the exception of like the fact that it seems like all these characters are black, with the exception of that, like race figures like even less prominently in this story than most of these stories for that matter. And like the story, like the title story, Lost in the City, race figures into it as well, but only to the extent that it's a very kind of like it's very much a contrast to what her life has become, right? It's not what you'd expect a black woman to be like, a high power job, rich, multiple investments, snorting cocaine, right? In this story though, there's this interesting kind of like aside early on with his mother and like white cops, right? So this is the way that it's described. When my brother and I were in our early teens, my mother said this to us with the most seriousness she had ever said anything. Never, even if you become kings of the whole world, I don't want you all messing with a white cop. The worst that my mother feared didn't happen to her baby boy that day. The cop only made me cross back on the green light and go all the way back to 7th Street. then come back to Fifth Street and cross again in the green light, then go back to 7th to do it all over again. Then I had to do it twice more. I was frozen through and through when I got back to Fifth the second time. And as I waited for the light to change after the 4th time, and he stood just behind me, I became very afraid that doing all that would not be enough for him, that he would want me to do more, and then even more after that, and that in the end, I would be shot or simply freeze to death across the street from the number 2 police precinct. Had he told me to deny my mother and father, I think I would have done that too. Right. So it's kind of like, first of all, it's a kind of a generic reality that, affects Black people. I've often said that when it comes to, policing and the Black community, for the vast majority of Black men, it's not so much that they will have a high chance of being murdered by a cop, right? Again, you have to be incredibly unlucky in America to be Black and murdered by a cop, but you get a lot more of this sort of generic harassment, right? Where it's stuff that will never make it into statistics. Like when I think about, knowing different people growing up and the kind of stories they would tell me, there's no way that would ever, like when people say, like, oh, like Black people, don't get killed all that much by cops. Like, even if you want to concede that point, how do you capture the fact that incidents like this, is stuff that, week after week after week, if you're like a young Black kid, will happen to you, like stuff like this, being shouted at, being patted down, like all sorts of kinds of harassment. Like every single week you would have a story.
Petty humiliation and embarrassment and emasculation if you're a man. And fucking Bloomberg made that shit policy. What was stop and frisk other than like, oh, cops can just kind of do a lower boiled version of this whenever they want to anybody they want, differentially affecting Black people. It's and at the time, the people that were in positions of power didn't even question it because, oh, crime, got to do something about crime. It's and that's why, like, it's not so much that the killing itself is an omnipresent reality of being a Black person. It's that it's an unavoidable thought in the back of your head because there is all this interstitial dominating behavior on the part of cops that reminds you that like that could happen to you.
Yeah. And you see that here, right? You see that in this little story, right? He's being kind of walked back in this kind of, harassing way back and forth. And he says, I'm expecting to be shot. Right. So that's always going to be in the back of your mind. And,
I was just going to say, it's interesting that it's not necessary to this particular story necessarily that like it's off the beaten path of the narrative, but it's a credit to Jones as an author that he can include that. And it's not like, it's not just, for PC's sake, like, oh, this is what happens to Black people. Like it factors into the narrative, this kind of interaction that he has with a white cop is part and parcel of the reason that, that he calls jobs for like white people slaves, because he perceives that fundamentally, no matter what is the like superstructural things in place to tell him that he is a full American citizen and equal and blah, blah, blah. He's not. He's never in a broader sense going to be treated that way, and you can't trust it.
Yeah. And going back to this idea of like, the slavery that he's undergoing, I mean, beyond this kind of like racialized sort of interaction here, I mean, there's also kind of like deeper, narrative and metaphorical import. I mean, when he says like, I became very afraid that doing all that would not be enough for him, that he would want me to do more and then even more after that. Right. This could be a stand-in for some of the ways that he might, especially early on in the story, feel about work. Right. Kind of like speaking to, early on, if he's kind of like willing to like fuck off, not show up at this job or that job, like sort of like not always do what he's supposed to be doing. maybe in the back of his mind, he's been in situations where he wants to say, like, fuck you to his employers, right? He wants to be able to escape that. And he feels like the suppression of, it's never going to be enough. It's never going to be enough. And part of that, part of that fear, that's baked into it. It's not that it simply comes out of immaturity, right? He does grow, he does mature, but you sort of see, like some of the reasoning here, right, in this kind of like more racialized lens, like where there's actually things that you can refer back to in reality, right? That gives him this feeling and this thought about what work is and the kinds of negatives associated with such.
Yeah. So after all this, he answers a newspaper advertisement for a clerk job in a grocery store in a different neighborhood than the one that he lives in. And he meets the secondary main character of the book, which is Penny, the proprietor of Al's and Penny's grocery store. I can't remember what the full title is.
Yeah, I think it's Al and Penny's. Yeah.
Yeah. Who, it's a very subtle and fine line that he writes here, because she is very close to like the sassy Black woman stereotype at times in the story, but
she's also really likable, right? Even early on.
Well, that's what I think. That's what kind of undoes it a little bit, is the sense that there is a real, like, almost like universal warmth and love that this woman feels for the neighborhood that she's got this store in. And even for this, young kind of fuck up guy that comes up and gets this job, she's clearly skeptical of him at first, because it's quite clear that she's chewed through a number of like shitty employees in the past that have not been willing to put up with her. Rather, it's hard to scale pay and working hours like from previous areas to the current area, but she wants him to work like 72 hours a week for $30 a week at the start.
It's like 12-hour days. Yeah.
12-hour days, 6 days a week, except for only Sundays and occasional holidays off. Like it's a rather big ask, and especially considering that she says that the pay is good in the advertisements too. Which maybe it was for the time period that this was taking place in. I don't have enough of a sense of, and I don't think it's specific. Does it give a date in this story? I can't remember. Some of the stories give dates. I don't know if this one does.
Yeah, I don't recall.
Yeah. So I don't know how good this pay is, but like she's making a big ask of somebody to come, but at the same time, like it makes sense because this store is like her life. It's something that she co-founded with her husband, who's now dead. Was he the one that died in the Korean War, or there's someone in the story that dies in a war off screen? I can't remember. But anyway, her husband is dead. Kind of this store is all that she has of this like past life and this more hopeful earlier era of her life that maybe she inhabited. And so if somebody's going to come in and be a part of that, she'd almost rather the store be kind of a shithole than have someone there that's not like really committed to it. So when he shows up there, like the backyard is overgrown. It's full of squirrels and trash. Like you can almost see the used condoms and shit that are probably sitting out there. And she basically tells him, fix this and you can be my employee. And he does. And somehow he comes back because the difficulty and rigor of the work, while it is alienating to agree, he also recognizes that, there is a sense of accomplishment on the other side of that. And that this is a person who has this is the first boss he's had that has like a soul to her, the hard work that she's putting him through is not just to wring a dollar out of him. It's to test whether he has the mettle to be a part of this life that she's built for herself.
Yeah. And as the story goes on, basically, he's getting better and better at the job. He's taking on more responsibilities. He's increasing his pay. He starts a relationship with a woman that is, I think her name is Kentucky.
Kentucky Connors.
Yeah. So he's with Kentucky. And a couple of interesting things happen. First of all, like Kentucky starts like being jealous like of the store, right? In the sense that like he's constantly, he's constantly over there when he gets like too tired, even though like Kentucky lives like a couple blocks away. Like he's like, you know what? I don't feel like walking all the way over there. I'm going to make myself a pallet in the back of the store and fall asleep there, which to me is just like fucking incredible. I can only sleep in my bed.
Yeah.
But
Anyway, it nicely, the whole thing with Kentucky nicely ties back into the fact that she really makes him wait for it when it comes to the sexual aspect of the relationship. I think they're dating for like a number of months before she lets him fuck her.
Yeah.
And before the first time they fuck, she pulls him, like she grabs him by the belt and she says, "Thou shalt have no other, no one else before me," or something, like, and it also ties into the fact that she's like she's real shitty to him the first time that he asks her out. She's really kind of a self-absorbed or self-confident person, depending on how charitable you want to read her. And so the fact that she's, sort of putting herself in like godly terms before him, like that's, in some ways, that's how she's not the right person for him. She's a little bit narcissistic. And so when he takes this job at the store very seriously, she is not willing to have something in his life be co-equal to her. And so she breaks up with him.
Yeah. And, part of that I think does speak to perhaps like, I guess you could say that he matures as the text goes on, as he becomes a better and better worker, as he becomes fixated on being good at his job here. But on the other hand, like Penny, like you mentioned this line before, she says that you should not mix, business and your personal life in this way. You should not be sleeping at the store. You need to clean up and you need to go home. And he's not really able to do that. And I definitely do get the sense that he might be over fixated on the store, right, to his detriment, right? So and
the grocery store, dude, like, get over it.
And also to her detriment. And on top of that, there's this kind of very quick throwaway line where I'm not sure if you noticed it, but it's an interesting, like, sort of, parallel to when she says, "Thou shalt have no other women before me." And he says, like, essentially, like, it's not even like a full sentence. It's like part of a sentence where he says, like, I cheated on her several times, So he does have sex with other women in the course of this relationship. But then when she finally, like, breaks up with him, he's like, "You fucking bitch." Right. So there's these like elements of like he's trying to become a well-adjusted, mature human being. The store definitely provides that discipline for him, which is why perhaps he has this kind of overfixation, even if you call it a personal detriment. But then in other ways, you see like other things that are kind of negatives, whether it's like sleeping in the store, not being able to go home, or, cheating on this woman that you claim to want to be with, and that you're even gonna also curse out, upon a breakup. So I mean, there's tons of like dimensions to his character, right? And also like to Penny, right? Like later on in the story, right? The real kind of turning point is when she accidentally kills a girl in her car, right? Just like someone like jumps out or something. So she kills like a little kid, and then after she kills this kid, she kind of like gives control of the store over to him, because she's not really welcome in the neighborhood. She's not, so she tries to like not really appear there, but she becomes this kind of like phantom, right? Where, like ultimately, let me see if I have this quickly. So page 98 for those that might be following along in the paperback. So like after all this happens, right, and she kind of like tries to control the store from the distance, about once a week for the next few years, Penny would call me at Kentucky's and arrange a place and time to meet me. We always met late at night on some fairly deserted street, like secret lovers, and we usually met in some neighborhood in far northeast or across the river at Anacostia, parts of the world I wasn't familiar with. I would drive up, park, and go to her car not far away. She wanted to know less about how I was operating the store than what was going on with the people in the neighborhood. She had moved from her apartment Southwest, and because I had no way of getting in touch with her, I always came with beaucoup questions about this or that to be done in the store. She dispensed with all the questions as quickly as possible, and not always to my satisfaction. Then she wanted to know about this one and that one, about so and whoever. Because it was late at night, I was always tired and not always very talkative. But when I began to see how important our meetings were, I found myself learning to set aside some reserve during the day for that night's meeting. And over time, the business of the store became less important in our talks than the business of the people in the neighborhood. And I found that a kind of interesting, understated detail because on the one hand, he's becoming attached to the store as a means of like self-discipline. It's like this like tangible, pragmatic thing that is doing various things for him. And she becomes this kind of like phantom, right? That hangs onto the neighborhood that she's kind of like essentially excommunicated from. She's being ostracized in that sense. So she's asking about the people. Perhaps like she's, I don't know if, it may be too pejorative to say that she's gossiping about these people, but he has less interest in these people and more interest in what the store could do for him and his character. She's more interested as a kind of like ghost, essentially, in what's going on in the neighborhood that she's not, allowed to be in anymore. And that also, as the text goes on, that shows you kind of like the ways that he's maturing and the ways perhaps that, this woman that you said, like she's almost kind of the sassy Black woman stereotype and essentially just becomes very self-confident. Like her confidence at this point has been shattered while his confidence is allowed to grow. So, she's kind of like giving him shit at the beginning of the story, like, making fun of him for not necessarily being the best worker or this and that. But that changes, right? So she has to regress in some ways, and he's allowed to become kind of more fully himself.
Yeah, it's a wonderful dynamic. It's very richly and subtly observed on Jones's part, and maybe it's not a shame that he hasn't written more stuff. Maybe he just didn't really make anything that was as good as this.
Yeah.
It's kind of the
or maybe he just had, had nothing. I mean, there's also like it's hard for us to imagine sometimes, like we look at people like Dan or whoever that constantly produce, but there are people out there that have some valuable things to say and then, maybe like don't have anything else to say.
Yeah. Well, it's the first album syndrome in music, where the first album that you produce is full of stuff that you have been working on for years and years and years, touring it, testing it, refining it. And it's sort of the product of thousands of hours of concerted labor. And then you have to make a second album and you have to write all of it from scratch, probably, unless you have, a bunch of stuff in the tank that you didn't put on the first album. And that's where if a band is going to falter, that's usually where it is, because they just have run out of ideas. They're not, they are not individually creative necessarily. The album or whatever that they made is more of like a social product of engagement with the community over the course of years or something like that. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's this. Yeah. Maybe he workshopped a lot of this stuff for a long time. I mean, I don't know in what span of time he wrote this book, but maybe a lot of this stuff was kicking around in him since he was a child or a teenager or something like that. And this is kind of when he put it all down. I mean, it's telling that the stories stop in the 80s, and this was probably published maybe 5 to 10 years after the latest point in any of the stories, and then he, like every Black male author, had a novel about slavery in him, and then after that, it's the well runneth dry, as they say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, but
yeah,
very, very. And then we should probably say, I mean, we're 2.5 hours into this stream, and we're not even halfway through the book at this point. Yeah. But we should probably just sum up and say that the story ends first he hires a woman to work under him that is nice, weird historical detail, like a Nation of Islam woman. I think her name is Gloria 5X, but her pre-Islam name was Puddin. And he sort of goes through the same process that Penny did, actually, where he hires a bunch of kind of malcontents and people without a lot of passion for the job. And then she actually does have some passion. She's got some kids to support, so she does a good job. And then ultimately, after he basically gets this place perfect, he puts a fresh coat of orange paint on it. He's got a new meat case. He's put dividers in the produce so that people can buy the bruised produce for a lesser price. He's perfected this thing that he's put all this effort into, and then Penny sells it. She tells him, it doesn't make any sense for me to own this anymore. The economics of it don't make sense. I'm not connected to it anymore. It's just a burden on me to have this. Here's 2 months of pay for Puddin', and here is $4,000 for you as severance pay, as essentially like the business partner in this endeavor. And he takes that money and he invests in an education at Georgetown University, which is, he's like 27 when he starts these classes, right? More mature and like able to like deal with this better. Which we now know as people in the year of our Lord 2021 means that he was probably on the road to becoming like a Thomas Sowell type, going to Georgetown University of all places, just this like, psychotic Black conservative who's like completely disconnected from his roots. But it's a happy ending to the story. It's internally, I feel like he's probably too mature to ever become a Thomas Sowell type. It is. And the story ends with him going back to this store that is now, he says it becomes a television repair shop and then something else. I can't remember. It turns into something completely unrelated from this thing that he spent all of his, these years honing it into being. But he is sitting outside of it, imagining himself having lunch in the early days of the store, having like a ham hock sandwich and some Snowball Hostess cupcakes. You said every single day he had Snowball cupcakes. Every day he had. That's like you in college with your Pop-Tarts pop. Yeah, that's 220 pounds of fucking college, up and down the fucking stairs, searching specifically for the brown sugar and cinnamon Pop-Tarts because I'm doing the other shit. And imagining himself like watching the girls. He explicitly says that they're high school girls at some point, which is a little unacceptable. Not in this part of the story, but in an earlier part of the story, he says like, oh, there's a lot of young women and high school girls hanging around the store, and that kind of made it worth my while to hang around there. Which not as acceptable nowadays to say, but he is at this point in his life where he's matriculating into this like white world that he once resented, this educated social climbing world that he in some ways seemed to resent Kentucky for being a part of. He is now entering himself, but he is drawn back to this point in his life where he was just coming out of his sort of loser phase of his life, and struggling to find meaning in this kind of objectively menial job that he could have justifiably walked off of after the first week of doing. But very nice story. You could go, even more than any other story in the book, you could probably just go line by line and find little subtleties and nuances and intricacies. But we're 2.5 hours into this particular video, and we're only four or five stories into this 14-story book. So
yes, it's a lot of yes. Okay, An Orange Line Train to Ballston is the next story. Maybe we shouldn't spend too much time on it. It's kind of short. Basically, it's about a single mother, Marvella Watkins, who is she's constantly going to and from work, taking her kids around to various places. The kids, I think, are either you know, like 8, 9, 10, maybe a little bit older, maybe, you know, like somewhere thereabouts. And
The little girl I think is like 4 though,
yeah,
because she's
yeah,
preschool.
yeah.
Yeah.
She comes across this man with dreadlocks that she develops this kind of like interest in, this like infatuation over. And I mean, he's, you know, the kids sometimes, you know, like try to like, you know, test him a little bit. He responds well. They seem to grow to like him. She seems to be attracted to this like fatherly quality that he shows, attracted to him also for other reasons. She starts like, you know, making her trips up in such a way that she could come across him more often, like take the same trains that he's on, even if this inconveniences herself and her kids. And eventually, you know, he just kind of like disappears, right? And she never sees him again. And this is kind of more or less where we end. I mean, it's a nice story. There's like some, like it's a nice little, you know, set of character sketches. You know, but
Jones was smart because unlike Young Lions and, in my opinion, the story His Mother's House as well, he kind of understood that this didn't need to be this like extended deep dive narrative into this person's psychology or whatever, like that she's not intrinsically that deep of a person. What is deep is her encounter with something outside of herself and the way that she engages with it.
Yeah.
You know, like I mean, you're right. This is not one that we need to spend a lot of time on, but that's not like a detriment. That's not a sign of the story's demerits or you know, lack of writerly finesse or anything like that. It's just short, and we're really long into this video already. But it's just a nicely observed portrait of a woman who, you know, probably has like some bad relationships in her past. I don't know if she talks about like, I don't know if all her kids have the same dad, but seemingly none of the characters in this story with multiple kids have only one dad for all of the kids, you know? So you could probably sort of fill in contextually that she's probably been with a lot of losers, or, you know, maybe just like other characters in the book lost some people tragically in some way or another. And she encounters this person that has this kind of exotic elements. You know, dreadlocks were not as common on Black people at the time that this story takes place in as they are now. And they certainly weren't accepted in, I mean, they're not even accepted now, but this is, you know, when people perseverate on the concept of Black hair and, you know, things that you theoretically could do to them to make them more manageable, but which are not acceptable in like polite white society. You know, this is the epitome of the era where it was thoroughly not accepted. You know, it was like a West Indian or a Jamaican it's her encounter with an affectation of Blackness that is outside of like what she usually experiences, you know. But he's put together, he's professional, you know, and it says at certain points that he's wearing ties, not with jackets, but, you know, button-down shirts. And he says that he's, you know, he doesn't get fired because he's so good at his job that they can't afford to fire him, even though they probably would like to, because he just looks so damn Black, you know. And she becomes infatuated with it, and then it falls away from her because, of course, it does. This was like a fantasy that she sort of interspersed herself into that dissipated away when he probably started taking a different train to work or got a different job, you know. Not a lot that needs to be said about it, but definitely an easy and quick read and worth your time if you are watching this. I don't know who's still watching this almost 3 hours into it, but if you are, definitely worth reading.
No, there's definitely people that watch this all the way through. I could tell in my YouTube analytics that there are plenty of them.
Well, that's good.
And also just another little detail. I mean, he seems to be described in a way that's like pretty wholesome, right? And like his lunch is like so fucking wholesome, right? He has like a sandwich, an apple, and a slice of cheese.
Yeah.
That's the way that people should be eating. So definitely a model, right? Which is, you know, part of the reason why you could expect her developing this infatuation over him. And anyway, so the next story, the Sunday following Mother's Day, I think from what I remember, Dan writing about this, he didn't think too much of the story, but I found just like lots of like little details here that are very interesting. So it begins with just like, we have this like senseless like murder, right, of Rhonda Ferguson. Here it begins with a girl, Madeline Williams, and she knows of the fact, right? She comes to know that her father, Samuel, ends up murdering her mother, just like stabbing her, right? And the way that it's described is when Madeline Williams was 4 years old and her brother Sam was 10, their father killed their mother one night in early April. If their mother sent forth to her children a cry of help or of goodbye, they did not hear it, at least not in any conscious level, and they slept clear through to morning. About 6:30 that morning, their father Samuel called his sister Maddie to tell her what he had done and how he had done it. I stabbed her a lot, Samuel said, and though Maddie was still rising up from sleep as he talked, those words were forever imprinted on her mind. So this is never explained. This is never something that, like in some senses, like you don't really need an explanation. Like in the book, again and again, right? You just get the sense like it's just one of those things. It's just one of those things. It
parallels nicely to the Rhonda Ferguson story as well, because that's a similar, it's perhaps a subtle commentary of the book is that this is a thing that keeps happening again and again. These Black men that are just like pressure cookers of rage associated with all of the bullshit that they have to deal with, and they end up taking it out on these women in their lives because they're the only sources of control that they have, really, but misogynistic society that they exist within, and yet people can only read this kind of thing in personal terms. They can only read this in terms of like, oh, you're a bad person, you're a monster, you did this, like not even though probably they know at least one other person that this shit happened to, if they're in any kind of way connected to the community, but they can only, that's the sad part of liberal society in a lot of ways, is these things that are clearly products of environment and circumstance, and not to diminish like moral culpability, but like you have to like read the moral culpability as like one of a series of factors that go into this kind of thing. And clearly based on his behavior in the rest of the book, like in the rest of the story, he instantly knew that it was wrong. He instantly knew like, oh, I fucked up. I didn't really want to do that. And I know that I shouldn't have done that, but I can't take it back. Throw the book at me, Judge.
Yeah. And like as the story unfolds, like you definitely get the sense. So, Samuel, he's in prison. He takes like full responsibility for everything that happens. Right.
He doesn't even try to defend himself in court.
Yeah, exactly.
The judge tells his defense attorney, like, you can't mount a defense for somebody that doesn't want to be defended.
Yeah. He just more or less admits it. And Madeline and I think some other of her relatives, they do visit him in prison, but she kind of stops at some point. But he continues to write letters to her and perhaps like the family at large. And she's the only one that ever really thinks about them, answers them. You could tell that she, on the one hand, doesn't want to meet him, right? Because she hasn't really forgiven him. But then on the other hand, she has this kind of curiosity about him, right? He becomes like a poet, right? He sends like her poems with these like very kind of, somewhat like generic titles. I forget what they are, but it's kind of like, it's stuff like sunlight through the bars of a cage or something.
It's like reflections on becoming a grandfather or something.
Yeah. Like stuff like that. And eventually though, she starts responding, right? She starts kind of like reciprocating, and he shows up and he like visits her like one day out of the blue. She's surprised to see him, but she doesn't like, she doesn't necessarily push him away. And before all that happens, that she does end up having a son with her, I think it's her boyfriend or her husband, with a man named Curtis. And he's born like either mentally retarded or has some other kind of like severe disability, where against the wishes of like the whole family and perhaps even her friends, she like sends the son off to some kind of like state ward like home, right, where like it's just for people, I guess, that are absolutely unable to live by themselves. They need all this care. In fact, when she visits him, I think it's like every Sunday that she visits him, there's no kind of like the son offers no indication that he enjoys her presence or that he enjoys like the food or whatever else that she brings to him. So like some days she just literally like forgets to bring him anything because she's like, well, what's the point, right? He's not gonna. So like you get this kind of like odd callousness like in her, right? And on the one hand, you don't truly want to blame her because they're like, I guess, like, from her point of view, there is no actual thing that he like extracts from these visits. Like there's no proof that this even matters, I guess, in some kind of like way. But then on the other hand, like you do see the callousness, and when Samuel gets out of prison and he gets this like job as a dishwasher and cook somewhere, he actually comes with her to this place, and he's the one that's like doting on her son, right? Because he's like a grandfather, right? Mm-hmm. He's the one that like wheels around her son and even like goes a long way, like away with him. And you have this like very interesting dynamic where he becomes like the one that is like loving and careful, possibly because like maybe he feels like he needs to make amends. Maybe he really does feel very guilty about everything that transpires. Maybe he does like need to like show something, right? But like the point is, like of the two of them, he seems to be by the end of the story an objectively better person. You could say, well, she never murdered anyone and he did. But on some level, this is a long time ago, right? He does not, like you said, try to defend himself in court or elsewhere. He comes to terms with his own behavior, and he's just trying to integrate into society in a way that's kind of normal. And you get the sense that he would probably never do such a thing again. And again, of the two of them, he's the one that's taking upon himself to, show some kind of love towards this kid. Right. And maybe at this point, he's not even like truly a kid anymore. But this is what happens when he comes back with this wheelchair, and Madeline and Maddie like see after like an hour or so, like he's coming back like with this kid. But anyway, like you get these like comments like Sam began to drool almost immediately. Right. Like, so like not really like cognizant of so much of what's going on. So like ultimately they put Sam in his wheelchair, and as Samuel wheeled the boy up the ramp, Madeline looked her father up and down. Don't you even know how to dress? Can't you see that the tie doesn't go with that suit, if you could call it a suit, with those shoes? Don't you even know how to match colors? Samuel said nothing. After they had returned Sam to the ward, Madeline waited in the infirmary lobby while her niece's husband drove Samuel to where his car was. In very little time, they returned with Samuel driving his own car, right? And she's upset that he took an hour with the boy, right? Like she's upset that he spent more time than she preferred to spend at the ward, despite the fact that this is the first time that he gets to see his grandson, right? Mm-hmm. So you could tell this kind of interaction that she has all this pent up anger and frustration that she can't let go. She can't let go of this past. He has tried to make amends. She cannot. And the way that the story ends is Madeline said nothing more to her niece, and she and Samuel drove silently back to Washington. At her apartment, she got out without a word and did not hear Samuel say that he was sorry. She opened the building's front door and made sure it was locked behind her. When she was back in her apartment, she looked out in the window and found that the car had died on him once again. The car was parked in the space near the entrance to the parking lot with its hood up, and Samuel was leading into the car, a man being swallowed up. She lived on the second floor facing the parking lot, and she could hear him and see what he was doing. White people passed and paid no attention to him. He worked late into the afternoon, now and again stopping to try and start the car or to step back and stare at it as if some solution might rise up from the roof and announce itself. The day was completely ruined for Madeline, and throughout the afternoon as her father worked, she sat angry in the chair with its back to the window. That morning, she had looked forward to going to the deli down the street, where she and Curtis sometimes bought sandwiches and pastries. But she knew she could not go out with Samuel blocking the path to the deli, and the deli would soon be closed. There were few cars or people passing, and most of the world was quiet. The loudest sounds were those of her father's muttering and of his tools against the car's metal, all of it reminding her, first before anything else, that the day was forever wearing itself away. I mean, you see such like extreme immaturity from her. Like, she can't make it to the deli because the father is there, right? She can't possibly like pass him. Like she cannot deal with her emotions, despite the fact that, I mean, look, she on some level is kind of leading him on, isn't she? She's like, she's like responding to the letters. Mm-hmm. She's sort of like almost like promising like maybe it'll be okay if we cultivate some kind of relationship. Well, and he does so. And instead, like, you just see by the end of it, like he's the one that's like more motherly. He's the one that's matured. He's the one that's like not only ready to move on in his life, but also like, like love her son that she seems to not really care too much about.
Yeah. It's like she's very solipsistic.
Yeah.
In her relationship with her father, she doesn't have any interest in what happened to her family as like an extension of herself and her life. Mm-hmm. And her brother kind of chastises her for this. He was old enough to have probably stronger memories of their mother and to really resent him for taking her away from him. And he basically tells her, what the fuck are you doing? Like, this guy killed our mom. How can you continue writing to him? And she's doing so, but she's not doing so out of some like, Jesus Christian forgiveness or anything like that. Mm-hmm. She is doing it because, she somehow feels like, if she understands him and she understands the crime, she bought the transcript of the court proceedings for like $100 or something like that from the state, that she can maybe make sense of her life. But she doesn't seem to really have any affection for her family, her father, even herself to an extent. The brother is kind of, and it's maybe a little bit of padding, to the extent that there's weakness in this story. I think it's just a little long.
Yeah.
But the brother presents an interesting counterpoint in this story, and there's a subtle, sly commentary on the sort of cumulative degenerative effects of absentee fatherhood in the Black mm-hmm. community in this book, which it doesn't specifically pin it down on like, criminological or sociological causes or anything like that. But mm-hmm. you have this man named Sam who is put in a pressure cooker of social existence, basically, and kills his mm-hmm. wife for whatever reason. And his son, who's also named Sam, who comes to resent him so much that he actually not only depersonalizes to the extent that he refers to himself in the third person, mm-hmm. yeah. or no, in the first person, like, not by his name,
yeah,
but by a plural pronoun for some reason. He starts saying, "We're going to do this," mm-hmm. In his later date, which is just a funny and kind of believable character detail for someone in that situation. And then her son, Sam, is this intellectually disabled person who is, basically without passion, without engagement with life, seemingly without memory at all, without anything other than just the most base instincts of like, oh, there's food on a spoon in front of me, I should open my mouth and swallow it. Seemingly without any kind of organic connection to anything outside of himself. So there's a nice interwoven commentary on the way that like the penal system has affected Black communities over time, and how they're like cascading effects of it that are not just Daniel Patrick Moynihan talking about single Black mothers or something like that, but that it sort of subtly imprints itself psychologically over time on people that are part of these communities.
Yeah.
It's a good story, a little overlong, but if it's not great, it's near great to excellent.
Yeah, it's. There's definitely a lot there. The next one is a title story, "Lost in the City." I don't have too much to say about it. I mean, it's this thing where, so her name actually is Lydia, right? She's called Cynthia by the initial like lover in the story, right? She's like, she's interrupted by a phone call. On the other end, there's the hospital staff, and they're telling her that your mother has died. Please come. She wakes up this guy like in her like attempt to get ready. He calls her Cynthia when in fact her name's Lydia. She doesn't even bother to correct him. She like pulls out Coke, starts doing, she says, just one little line of Coke, right? And then she ends up doing more and more Coke as the story goes on, and ends up just kind of like driving around the city in this taxi cab. And she has lots of money. She puts like $60 down and says, just get us lost, right? Just drive and drive and drive and drive before she finally makes it to the hospital. It's not, this isn't a bad story or anything, but it just reminded me a lot of like growing up, like you listen to like, music, for example, ostensibly like about drugs or whatever, or like, there's like, there's like there's like all the kind of like writers that you read growing up that talk about like being high or whatever. And they often try to like invoke the feeling of being high within the text itself. And it's always like this like extreme slippery slope, because essentially, you have this like significant risk of making the narrative itself and the details themselves very kind of meandering, right? As you try to capture like what a drugged out haze is like. And this story avoids the worst of that. But it doesn't, it's not that it doesn't say anything. It does have this nice kind of like beginning to ending where it sort of ends with kind of like this, imagination backwards, like a memory of like her mother telling her something that comes to be a bit symbolic for her. But it is kind of like, it is kind of like scattershot in some ways.
Yeah. So it's a good story. If I was Edward P. Jones writing it, I don't know that I would give it the title of the short story collection, because I don't think it quite holds up the weight of that as well as it could.
Yeah.
Although he saves it because it's also a line in the first story of the collection, which is much stronger. Mm-hmm. You're right that it sort of flirts with the worst of the like drug prose that has existed. It almost falls into that. I think the reason that it avoids it is more contextual than artistic. Mm-hmm. I mean, not that that's not artistic, but it's not necessarily specific to the prose. It's the fact that instead of some, white hipster like a Hunter S. Thompson or a William S. Burroughs or someone like that, it is this Black woman who is now rich, but quite clearly grew up like, poor to middle class or something like that. And she is falling back into this past that she feels like she has left behind. But now that her mother, her perhaps last organic connection to that past, has fallen away. She can't help but want to try to reclaim it for herself. So to the extent that it is saved from the annoyingness of drug pros, it's because it's a different kind of character than you usually see doing this.
Yeah.
And because the character is in a situation where it's not in any way whatsoever glorifying the drugs or trying to make it seem cool or interesting. Like, if anything, the drug inflected aspect of it is artistically strong, but makes it perhaps like the least pleasant story in the collection to read, because it is like meandering, and it sort of it's the most solipsistic story on the part of the character that is narrating or that it is centered around of the stories. And I don't think that's an artistic merit, but in terms of personal enjoyment and also in terms of rereadability and depth, I would say it is sort of like stunted in a way the rest of the stories in the collection are not. I would put this down there with Young Lions as like one of the weaker stories in the collection, but that's not to say it's not good. It's just, if every story was this quality, we wouldn't be doing a video about it.
Yeah. And also, like, I mean, speaking to some of the artistry, like some of the self-talk that she's experiencing, right? I mean, it's well crafted, right? So as she's getting ready to leave the house to go to the hospital, in the shower, Lydia held her face as close as she could to the nozzle. After she had finished, she soaped herself again. "Best get his smell off of me," she said to the water, "or else when I walk in there, they'll know I've been fucking. The nurses and doctors will look at me and they'll say, 'Why, Mrs. Walsh? Your mother lies moldering and you've been fucking.'" Right? I mean, it's just kind of funny, right? "Forgive me, Father, for I have been fucking," she said to the mirror. She toweled off. The exhaust fan made a low humming sound, barely audible even in the quiet of the night. But though the repair people had been there 4 times, it was still too loud for her. "No sound," she said to the second repairman. "Absolutely no sound whatsoever. Can you manage that?" And so you get, in the one hand, is kind of like she knows that she's kind of like fucked up in many ways. To your point, like there is no kind of celebration of her kind of cocaine habit. And then you get this kind of like ending here where, she's like so self-obsessed. No sound, right? She's talking to some like blue collar type. Absolutely no sound whatsoever. Can you manage that? As if like you can't fucking handle an exhaust fan, right? It's just so, it's kind of extreme in some ways. Yeah.
The next story is called His Mother's House.
Yeah.
It's another story about, I guess, kind of the criminal underbelly of Washington, D.C., this time told from a perspective of a character who seems to be more of a Manny than a Caesar. Someone who has kind of some clout and some wealth and infamy within the community of criminals, to the extent that his mother's lover, Ricky, has like fallen into his entourage as like his driver or whatever.
And I think that's probably the best part of the story, where you have like a very gradual unfolding of all of that, right? Where you're wondering, why is this like kid speaking so casually and rudely to this like much older man, right? Especially in the setting of like, being, probably in the 90s or 80s, perhaps even 70s or whatever, that's not really an interaction that you'd normally have like in the Black community. And yet this is what's going on. And very slowly, all this stuff gets revealed, right? But when, the character gets more or less revealed, some of the other stuff, like the drug addict character, I forget his name, that shows up. When he shows up, and that he's like been using the drugs he's supposed to be selling, and he owes, he owes this what is this guy's? Oh, Santiago. He owes Santiago money. You sort of know like exactly where this is going, right? And ultimately, like the probably like the worst ending, I think, of all the stories here, where Santiago, who was supposed to be a competent criminal, or rather competent enough that he's literally able to buy this mansion for his mother and have like multiple employees or whatever. He just like shoots this guy that owes him money in front of like a dozen plus people, you know, in the middle of the street, middle of the day, like not caring. Like it's just, you know, it's not something that makes any kind of sense if you're talking about any sort of realism here with someone that has sort of gotten high enough, right, in this kind of criminal enterprise, right? I could imagine like some, you know, complete like fucking like nobody maybe doing something like this.
Yeah, some tweaker loser who fell into it, like doing something stupid like that. But he wouldn't have gotten to this point if he was, capping people in front of a big crowd of witnesses.
Yeah.
It's probably like the Young Lions and Lost in the City. It's probably in lower echelon of tales in the book. I might even actually, I think I said Young Lions, but Young Lions is first of all shorter than this one. Yeah, and it's
has a better ending for one, right?
It has a little better of an ending, and the subplot of for some reason becoming obsessed with the idea of ripping off an intellectually disabled woman is like a little different than something you would see in like a typical crime story or something like that, you know. It feels a little more rooted in, maybe because it's a lower level criminal, and so Jones can kind of empathize with and intuit something about that side of crime, whereas like someone who's higher up on the chain is a little more divorced from his own experience, and he has to fill in the gaps in ways that I think fall short. I mean, it's not a bad story. In fact, compared to most of what gets published, I'd say it's a very good story. Yeah. You know, but relatively speaking, it's probably the one that needs to be reread the least. Actually, the detail when I was rereading it, that was the one that stuck out to me the most, is the beginning of the story, where despite this nice house that he's gotten for his mother, she is like really attached to this shitty coffee table that she puts pictures in. Sort of be sort of retaining something of her previous life before her son became a criminal or whatever. And the detail that as I recall, I think like Ricky kind of wants to have a kid with her, but she is like either infertile or she's taking birth control or something like that. And this sort of subtle.
Yeah, I think she had some kind of she had a surgery, right? And she never
or she had her tubes tied or something. She's leading him on about the possibility of having a kid with him, and it's kind of implied that like whatever she lets her son give him, she recognizes on an intuitive level that he's like kind of a monster and a scumbag. Yeah.
And she doesn't want to like perhaps reproduce like another child like this, right? Like that's also a possibility. That's what I was thinking, because it's never actually explained why she is leading on Ricky, right, about this, right, and pretending like, oh yeah, we could get pregnant, let's just continue trying, right? So that's one of the possibilities. And also like the one person that really confronts her about this is her mother, right? And she's like, I don't want any of Santiago's money, I don't want this, I don't want that. If he ever comes here, I'm going to call the cops on him. Right. So she essentially wants nothing to do with her grandchild. And like she's kind of going through the story, like on the one hand, like denying what's obvious, which is, her son is a piece of shit. And then on the other hand, like clearly knowing that and just kind of, sweeping it under the rug, right? She's like full of all these like, understatements, even when he like shoots, does she end up like slapping him or something, or does she never take it that far?
This one, I must admit, is one of the ones.
Yeah, she does slap him. Yeah. So she does slap him, right? But even after she slaps him, she was like, like she didn't want to think about her child in this cruel world without a place to come to, right? So, I mean, not a very good ending, but still, like I think a good like character build up. It's just that, like you mentioned how in Young Lions there's that like intellectually disabled woman that appears, right, that Caesar wants to exploit somehow. And when she first appears, knowing that, Caesar is a murderer, or like a would-be murderer, like there's this kind of tension immediately where you're like, oh shit, is he going to try to like murder this like intellectually like disabled woman, like that's just kind of trying to live her life, or something else going to happen. And there's that tension throughout here, kind of right away that when this guy's been like picking into like his drugs and all that, that he's going to get killed at some point, right? Especially as the tension escalates. And the fact that it happens in the way that it happens, like the ending just really kind of tanks.
Well, there's a tension and a strangeness to Young Lions that I think sort of propels it a little higher. Like with that whole subplot, the fact that, I mean, this is clearly a super scummy thing he's doing, like trying to get like a couple $100 or $1,000 out of this intellectually disabled woman with this lie. Mm-hmm. And yet, if you did that same thing and you called it a charity or a corporation, nobody would bat an eye at it. Mm-hmm. There's like, I don't know. There's a sense of the uncanny in mm-hmm. Young Lions that is lacking in His Mother's House, which is the most generic tale in the book. Yeah. So I don't have a lot else to say about that. Do you?
Yeah, we could move on.
Yeah, expedite. Next one is another one. The book sort of has a like a long tail, short tail kind mm-hmm. of structure. Not perfectly, but the next one is a much shorter piece called A Butterfly on F Street, which the elevator pitch summary would be: a woman has an encounter on the street with the woman that her husband left her for and spent the last couple cancer-ridden years of his life with.
Yeah. And there's actually not too much else that happens here, but like I think one of the more interesting inversions in the story is, she sees her and, she's immediately kind of like caught off guard and kind of like resentful, kind of like, she feels like she doesn't want to be intruded upon by this woman, essentially like, his mistress. But so like Mildred Harper is the name of the woman that is left by the husband. When she comes across the mistress starts to like really, she's being kind, right? She's being understanding. And ultimately, like, it's kind of like kind and understanding enough that Mildred feels that she's the one, meaning Mildred is the one that's interfering with the mistress now. Like, she's interfering with her grief, that she's kind of like this interloper, right? Mm-hmm. Which is it's like a nice little kind of inversion, but it's also mm-hmm. just like a very kind of small tale, right? Not too much happens. Not much else, I don't think, that you could really talk about at any rate.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely, it's an excellent story. It's just kind of hard to talk about because it's dialogue heavy. There's a lot of like subtleties and intricacies to the dialogue mm-hmm. that you don't really come across as well in like an abstract discussion of it. So worth reading, but probably I must admit the next couple also escaped me a little bit. Gospel.
Yeah,
I have. What is this one even about? I don't remember this one.
Yeah, Gospel's. I think Gospel. It's going to be in a similar category to some of those kind of like lesser stories as well. So like Vivian is the main character. She also has a.
This is the one about the church choir. Yeah.
The church choir.
No, this one's pretty good actually. I've completely blanked on it until you said that. And now I remember.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, basically, my criticism of this story is that, I mean, so like as far as the things about it that are interesting is, so like Vivian has this husband that's also dying of cancer, and she seems to be like kind of resentful of him, and also resentful of the fact that whenever he goes into treatment, he's the one that looks like so energetic and strong, right? And she looks like the one that's sick, right? When it's in fact the other way around. And you do find this kind of like dynamic between Vivian and the other church ladies, right? They're these gospel singers that do this professionally, and they go from church to church where they have like tons of like competition with one another, right? Not only like between each other, like as gospel singers, but also like other gospel groups. They're constantly sort of like gossiping about
The rival gospel group is such a funny addition to the tale.
And they're always like gossiping about
the tale follows the second string gospel choir in Washington DC.
There's like tons of like little bits of gossip, like, and they're supposed to be like, like women of Christ, but you see them like engaging like all sorts of like hypocrisies and like bits of like like I guess like various kinds of like sinfulness. I think the most kind of telling one is in the end, like it's like Vivian and Diane, right? They seem to be like pretty close friends, and Diane seems to be cheating on, either she has a boyfriend or husband, I don't remember. Diane is cheating on him with like this guy, right? That is like waiting for her in this car. She meets him in this car. She kisses him, and Vivian sees this and she gets like very upset. Like, you're not supposed to be doing this, so on and so forth. But part of the reason why she gets upset, like I think this is like in terms of like of what is of psychological interest in the story, is like building upon some of the more gossipy elements of the story, right? You see some of the psychology borne out in that way. You also get this kind of like sense where the reason why she's so upset at Diane isn't the fact that Diane's like this new boyfriend or whatever. He's like very much a gentleman, right? But the way that she views his gentlemanly qualities is, oh, he took off her hat. He took off his hat, right, when they met, right? This is like the thing that she focuses on. And she's like, God, like I wish that there would be some man around today that would take off his hat for me, right? He's so just like we have like in the night Rhonda Ferguson was killed, Cassandra really kind of like loses her shit at the fact that after being rejected by this guy because of her kind of like crazy behavior, she starts like taking it out on these women. She's kind of like doing the same thing, because here is this kind of like like apex male kind of like in her kind of like infatuated mind, and yet the thing is, like, he's engaged in the same kind of sinfulness that she's like berating Diane over, right? It's just like he's not actually a gentleman, right? He has like all the trappings of being a gentleman. He's going to be willing to like raise his hat to you, but he's still going to fucking help you cheat on your husband, right? So he's not actually a gentleman. So anyway, like those are the elements that I found of sufficient interest to comment upon.
Yeah, no, I guess the general thrust of the story, you could say, is the idea of this kind of beautiful or nice thing that you've built for yourself, and yet there's all these forces that are pressing on it at all times that threaten to tear it apart, whether it's cancer in your marriage or the sinfulness of infidelity or the young talented one in their church choir that the rival church choir is constantly trying to poach from them and like completely destroy any interest that anybody would have in their shitty little church choir. And sort of the hypocrisies and self-compromises that are inherent in trying to be a good person in a not so good world. You know, it's like any tale in the book. It is good to excellent in a moment to moment sense, but less substantive talking about it in the in this kind of a forum. What's the next one?
A new man is a very interesting story.
It's pretty short, isn't it? As I recall, relatively compared to some of them.
Yeah, not definitely not that long. Let me see if there's like if I get page count. It's about like 20 pages or so, maybe a little bit less. Yeah, maybe more like 13, 12, something like that. And so, I mean, basically, it's about a man who, Woodrow Cunningham, basically, he has heart troubles. He catches his daughter one day home early from school. Maybe it's like a half day of some sort. Maybe he comes home early, and she's just like with two boys in the apartment that they live in, and she's like smoking cigarettes with them. Maybe like they're going to have sex, maybe not. I mean, who knows? You get the sense that she's not as bad of a girl, right? As she in fact is in her father's mind. In fact, like when Woodrow starts like criticizing her, you definitely get the sense that she's been through this before. She's sort of scared of him, I guess, of like, you know, he physically hits her when, you know, she's kind of like out of line, but she seems to be like growing up now and becoming like less responsive to this. She tries to be, let's call it, reasonable about stuff. And she's like basically she runs away, right? She runs away when I guess she doesn't want to live there anymore. And I think part of that, honestly, like it's kind of like it's not explicitly stated, but it does seem that Woodrow is kind of hard on his daughter. And there's even like this line there. It's like very nice where he sort of he starts kind of like shouting at her, and the line is he realized that he was simply parroting himself, right? This kind of like image of himself in this kind of like ideal platonic form of the stern father that will control the daughter and keep her from going astray. But it has become so like automatic at this point, so kind of pointless. And she says at some point, like, you know what, like no matter what I'll do, I will still get this kind of treatment. So she just one day up and disappears after this interaction. And he and his wife end up going on this kind of, you know, search, right, for their daughter. And little by little, you know, it's clear that they're not going to get her back. She's not coming back. No one knows where she is. They, you know, eventually file a missing person report. She's never found. And then little by little, they start to forget her, and they start to forget all the, you know, like the fact that, you know, she's essentially lost, right? And they don't really talk about this anymore. And this starts to become this like weird kind of situation where her mother keeps asking Woodrow about this story, right? Like tell me what you saw when the boys were here. What was the daughter's name is Elaine? What was Elaine doing? What was she up to? And eventually this starts to take on this kind of like nightly ritual almost. And this is how it gets characterized. So Rita is the name of the wife. What happened, Rita would ask as they prepared for bed. What he told her and her listening replaced everything they had ever done in that bed, discussing what future they wanted for Elaine, lovemaking, sharing what the world had done to them that workday. What happened? It was just about the only thing she ever asked Woodrow as the months grew colder. What happened? What'd you say to her? By late February, when fewer and fewer people were going out to search, he had told the whole story, but then he began to tell her things that had not happened. There were 3 boys, he said at one point, for example. Or he could see a gun sticking out of the jacket pocket of the light-skinned one, and he could see the outline of a knife in the back pants pocket of the third. Or he would say that the record player was playing so loudly he could hear it from the street. They were small embellishments at first, and if his wife noticed that the story of what happened was changing, she said nothing. In time, with winter disappearing, he was adding more and more so that it was no longer a falseness here and there that was embedded in the whole of the truth, but the truth itself, an ever diminishing kernel that was contained in the whole of falseness. And like some kind of bedtime story, she listened and drifted with his words into a sleep where the things he was telling her were sometimes happening. I mean, I got more to say, but I've been talking a lot about this already. Maybe you got some input on the story.
No, it's a really excellent story. The ending is really nice too, where throughout, as I recall, throughout the first part of the story, you get these like letters from his like sickly elderly father, like
Yeah,
offering.
I want to read one of these letters later. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, offering to come and help him find his daughter. But
Mm-hmm.
then you find out at the end of the story, like to the extent that, I mean, assuming that probably the likeliest thing is that she ran away and just
Yeah,
went somewhere where he could never find her.
yeah,
Uh, the roots of this are themselves in the sort of weird parenting style of his father,
yeah.
where he had a system where the child that worked the hardest got to sit the closest to him at the dinner table every night. And so Woodrow, for whatever reason, really, really desired his father's love and approval. I mean, I guess we all
Mm-hmm.
do, but he wanted it more than any of his siblings. And he essentially brown nosed his way into being his father's right hand man. But you can imagine how that sort of conditional nature of love in that relationship inflecting the way that he dealt with his daughter to the point where she understood, like, oh, you only love me if I behave a certain way. You don't, like, if I get naughty with some boys or something like that, your love for me goes away or it diminishes. This isn't really what I want out of life. It's not really anything that's fulfilling for me. I'm getting the fuck out of here.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it's a nice story, especially some of the descriptions of their loneliness and lostness as the dawning reality of the fact that their daughter is not coming
Yeah,
back kind of blossoms.
yeah,
Very, very memorable prose.
yeah. And like, it seems like the father also is kind of, he seems to be like either maybe like slowly losing his mind. So this is this is how these letters get characterized. By March, Woodrow had written countless letters to his father, telling the old man it was not necessary to come to Washington to help look for the girl. I got a sign from God, the old man kept writing, that I could help find her. Then, with spring, he began writing that he had received signs that he was not long for the world, that finding the girl was the last thing God wanted him to do. In the longest letters the old man had ever written to the one child of his who responded, he would go on and on about the signs he saw signaling his own death. The mongrel would no longer take food from his hand. The dead visited him at night, sitting down on the side of his bed and telling him things about himself. The rising sun now touched his house last in the morning, though there were houses to the left and right of his. You keep telling me that I'll be hurt or lost, the old man wrote Woodrow, but I know the way that Washington, D.C. is set up. I came there once, maybe twice. How could I get lost? Take a chance on me, and we'll have that child back home before you can blink one eye. I can bring Sparky. He got some bloodhound in him. I just found that to be such a, such a beautiful little detail because, the father, maybe he was a tyrant at some point in his life, but now all his kids have deserted him. The one kid, Woodrow, is kind of like still in his life a little bit. And maybe he was a tyrant once, but at this point in his life, he's just, he's lost all his powers, right? He's reduced to saying things like, I'll bring my own kind of like, old dog, essentially. He's got a bloodhound in him, just being completely sort of useless, paralleling, interestingly enough, this growing recognition on the part of Woodrow that he himself has like lost his powers. He cannot bring back his daughter. And the way that both Rita, his wife, and him respond to the loss, like they kind of like take this like interesting kind of opposite approach, right? Where Woodrow loses a ton of weight and Rita gets very fat. So, and this is the way that it gets characterized. Rita and Woodrow were back in the apartment on Independence Avenue in Southeast by 10 o'clock that night. Rita took her usual place at an easy chair near the window. On a table beside the chair was all she needed: the television guide, snacks, the telephone. The chair was very large and had to be specially ordered because she could not fit into the regular ones in the store. Woodrow, even though the hour was late and the weather people were predicting even colder temperatures, quietly put on his heaviest coat and left the apartment. He said nothing to Rita, and she did not look up when the door locked behind him. At the corner of Independence and 15th, Woodrow looked into the grocery store window at the owner he had become friends with since moving to Southeast. No customers went into the store, and the owner was dozing behind the counter, his head back, his mouth open. Woodrow watched him for a very long time. By now, he knew everything about the man and his store and the sons who helped the man, and there was no urgency to be inside with him. Having lost so much weight, Woodrow felt that even more of the world had opened up to him. And so he wondered if he should go on down to 15th Street, try to find a house he had not visited before, and bring out the picture of the child in her Easter dress. And this is how it ends. I mean, very a nice ending, very just psychologically rich and complex. The fact that, Rita doesn't even notice him leaving the house. It's just this ritual that they do. He's losing weight, she's getting fat, she's watching television, eating snacks next to the phone, next to the television. He's just kind of running around, searching, right? And kind of becoming like his old father, right? Who at this point has already died.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really great story. I wish I wish that it was earlier in the book so that we maybe had slightly more time to talk about it.
Yeah,
but we should, because the last story is a lot, so we should probably save some time for that. The second to last story, the penultimate story, is A Dark Night, which I think you said you don't have as much of a memory of or as much to say about. I actually just reread this one today, so I'm really bad with the fucking character names in this book. Do you have those written, the character names written down anywhere? Or?
No.
Anyway, that's not super important. So it's essentially about a group prayer session that is put together by some women at a church. They've got a bunch of snacks and drinks. I think there's fruit punch and a cake. And they have invited the local priest over to sort of lead them in a prayer circle. And they have invited this cranky old 91-year-old woman to be a part of this, who used to be good friends with the main character, Beatrice. Beatrice, the main character of the story. But they have at some point had a falling out, which is not... The story smartly doesn't go into super explicit detail about what's caused them to fall out. It's just sort of implied that this older woman, Mrs. Garrett, she sort of got older and crankier and more toxic over time. And
I remember this a little bit. And when she suddenly shows up, it's a very kind of interesting little dynamic that develops.
Yeah, and she's talking shit about the priest.
Yeah.
She says, "What time was the priest supposed to come?" And they say 3:30, and she says, "Well, every clock in the world says that it's after 4:00 now." Really,
yeah.
Mrs. Garrett was one of my favorite characters in the book, even though she's kind of a slight character. But basically, the priest never shows up. He calls 3 hours later and says, "Oh, my car wouldn't start. I can't get there. Sorry." And so they decide to just eat all of the food that they brought and gossip. And it's raining outside, and they ask Beatrice to tell the story about the darkest night, which is a half story, half joke. Or no, another character tells the story, which the title of the story comes from an in-joke that one of these characters in this prayer group tells, where I guess her grandfather had a joke about one night it was so dark that there came a knock at the door, and there was a bunch of raindrops outside that said, "Excuse me, can you tell me which way is the ground?"
Mm-hmm.
Which is pretty funny. You know, it's a
Mm-hmm.
charming little joke, but the kids found it very, very funny. And then Beatrice tells this story of how when she was younger, like 16, 17, she was at her parents' farm with like a young guy that she was dating. And a cousin of hers like emerges from the cornfield completely bewildered, disheveled, disoriented. And he runs away back to his house and they follow him. And they realize that this house full of people, everybody except for the baby, is dead because the house was like struck by lightning.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it was like the exact cause of death in this instance is a little obscure to me, unless everything in the house was conductive for some reason. I think maybe it was like the lightning hit the chimney and started a fire and they all perished from smoke inhalation, something along those lines. It's a little obscure, but the thrust of the story is that she has seen this, you know, horrific thing that happened as a result of a lightning storm. The prayer group breaks up. It's late at night. The storm is getting worse and worse. The old woman, Mrs. Garrett, is sitting there and she basically has like a vision of death coming for her as a result of the storm. So she goes to Beatrice's house and says, "I'm so scared. Can I hang out with you for a while?" And Beatrice says, "No, we're not friends anymore, you old bitch. Like, what are you talking about?" But she takes pity on her and she lets her come in. And the story has, I actually think, maybe the nicest, maybe the best ending of any of the stories in the book. It's a really, really great closing line and paragraph. So Mrs. Garrett says, "How long do you think it might last, B? How long? Why do you always ask me such stupid goddamn questions?" The blanket did nothing to moderate the violence of the thunder, and it continued to sound as if it were outside the door. "Ain't you going to blow out the candle?" Mrs. Garrett said. Beatrice leaned over and blew lightly, and in the quickest of moments, the room was engulfed in darkness. Mrs. Garrett began to pray, a long, monotonous mumble of words. Once or twice, a boom would produce a small yelp of surprise from each woman, but they did not comfort one another. Over time, the intensity of the thunder grew until it was like a pounding at the bathroom door. And each time it pounded, the woman would look toward the door as if they were making up their minds whether to get up and answer it.
Yeah.
Really, really great closing line to the story. One of the strongest of the book. The tale itself, I would say, is rather slight. It's kind of a nice little slice of life story about these two people that are at different points of their life, brought together over like a shared troubling at a rather bad storm. One because of the way that it correlates to her past, the other because she has reached a point in her life where death is pretty much a constant worry, which if you're a nurse, you know, someone in their 90s, there is never a moment where death is not constant. We have an algorithm that tells us whether we need to pay special attention to patients, whether they are at increased risk of deterioration in the next 8 hours. And it averages their age and their health history and their vital signs and their lab results. And anybody over 90, like, you better hope they don't fucking sneeze, or it's going to be more work for you because you're going to have to get vital signs very frequently on this person, because just the risk of death so much higher. So I don't have a lot to say about it. I think it's a good story, worth reading. Great last line, but just a nice, a slight little slice of life.
Yeah, I mean, some of it it's been like about a month since I read this story, which is why I don't have too much to say. Because originally we planned on doing this like a month ago. And I actually reread most of this morning, but didn't get a chance to go over this one. So, I mean, let's just tackle the last one, Marie, which it's definitely one of the best, like flat out, like one of the best stories in this collection, for many different reasons. And I mean, let's just see the way that it starts, right? There's so much here, right, from the very beginning. Every now and again, as if on a whim, the federal government people would write to Marie Delavue Wilson in one of those white stampless envelopes and tell her to come into their place so they could take another look at her. They, the Social Security people, wrote to her in a foreign language that she had learned to translate over the years. And for all the years she had been receiving the letters, the same man had been signing them. Once, because she had something important to tell him, Marie called the number the man always put at the top of the letters. But a woman answered Mr. Smith's telephone and told Marie that he was in an all-day meeting. Another time she called and a man said Mr. Smith was on vacation. And finally, one day a woman answered and told Marie that Mr. Smith was deceased. The woman told her to wait and she would get someone new to talk to her about her case. But Marie thought it bad luck to have telephoned a dead man and she hung up. I mean, this is like exactly like speaking of like earlier when we were discussing the first day from like a child's point of view. This is definitely, you know, a really good, you know, set of insights into an old woman's point of view, right? Having had, you know, a great grandmother, a grandmother, like a little detail, like once because she had something important to tell him. Marie called the number the man always put at the top of the letters. You know, so many grandmothers all the time kind of inflate the stakes of like the importance of something they have to say, right? And
Yes, they do.
And you know, like especially with Russian grandmas and like grandma adjacent types, you know, and like little things like she's superstitious about the bad luck, and this gets kind of like, you know, like smashed into this like wider idea of perhaps people at the government office, at the Social Security office, are going to, you know, keep me from getting my checks. You know, maybe they're going to get upset at me in some way. You know, this starts to like, you know, come to the fore like very quickly as the story goes on. And this is ultimately, we should say, is about that, right? Marie, who is concerned about her future, I think it's like Social Security payments, right?
Yeah.
So
well, yeah. So she. What happens is she has to go to these like regular check-ins to make, I think, basically to make sure that she's still alive and that they're not sending the checks out to her family or something like that. She goes to one and they keep her there for several hours. And then they say, oh, actually, the person you need to see is not in today. I thought they were. Sorry.
Yeah.
And then she's very annoyed by this. And the next time that she comes at like 8 a.m. And then at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she still has not seen anybody. Again, this sort of, you know, inherent alienation and distrust of bureaucracy kind of rears its head, and the way it tears people apart from normal human interactions that they might otherwise have. And this secretary is like completely ignoring her and acting annoyed every time she goes like, am I going to see anybody today? I've been here for a very long time. And this secretary is chatting with another secretary about bullshit, just gossiping. And she goes up and says, when am I going to see someone? She's like, you'll see someone when you see someone. And she slaps the secretary. And she gets carted out by security. And then she spends the rest of the story in like abject fear that means she's never going to get a Social Security check again. But she also completely ignores it too, which like hoping it'll go away.
Because it's kind of like, you know, what are you supposed to do as an old lady, right? Especially if you have these kinds of fears. And I mean, even early on, right? Like now, years after the woman had told her Mr. Smith was no more, the letters were still being signed by John Smith. Come into our office at 21st and M Streets Northwest, the letter said in that foreign language. Come in so we could see you if you are still blind in one eye. Come in so we could see if you're still old and getting older. Come in so we can see if you still deserve to get supplemental security income payments, right? So just this kind of like, you know, overarching idea that this is all going to be means tested, right? They want to see whether you're still blind, right? Which is just kind of ridiculous. But in this kind of situation, right, everyone is pinching pennies, as it were. Come in to see if you're still old and getting older.
Yeah.
So she just has this kind of like fear throughout the entire text, right? But you definitely get the sense that she is someone that would at least try to stand up for herself, right? We mentioned earlier on how there's this kind of like interplay between the young lion story and this, right? Where perhaps it's Caesar that tries to just like steal the pocketbook, right? And and this is just kind of, this is like a very like wonderful little interaction. One of the last things she put in her pocketbook was a 7-inch or so knife that she had, with the use of a small saw borrowed from a neighbor, serrated on both edges. The knife, she was convinced now, had saved her life about 2 weeks before. Before then, she had often been careless about when she took the knife out with her, and she had never taken it out in daylight. But now she never left her apartment without it, even when going down the hall to the trash drop. She had gone out to buy a simple box of oatmeal, no more, no less. It was about 7 in the evening, the streets with enough commuters driving up 13th Street to make her feel safe. Several yards before she reached the store, the young man came from behind her and tried to rip off her coat pocket where he thought she kept her money, for she carried no purse or pocketbook after 5 o'clock. The money was in the other pocket with the knife, and this hand caught in the empty pocket long enough for her to reach around the knife and cut his hand as it came out of her pocket. He screamed and called her an old bitch. He took a few steps up 13th Street and stood in front of Emerson's Market, examining the hand and shaking off blood. Except for the cars passing up and down 13th Street, they were alone, and she began to pray. "You cut me," he said, as if he had only been minding his own business when she cut him.
Yeah.
"Just look what you did to my hand," he said, and looked around as if for some witness to her crime. There was not a great amount of blood, but there was enough for her to see it dripping to the pavement. He seemed to be about 20, no more than 25, dressed the way they were all dressed nowadays, as if a blind man had matched up all their colors. It occurred to her to say that she had 7 grandchildren his age, that by telling him this, he would leave her alone. But the more filth he spoke, the more she wanted him only to come toward her again. "You done crippled me, you old bitch." "I sure did," she said, without malice, without triumph, but simply the way she would have told him the time of day had he asked and had she known. She gripped the knife tighter, and as she did, she turned her body ever so slightly so that her good eye lined up with him. Her heart was making an awful racket, wanting to be away from him, wanting to be safe at home. "I will not be moved," some organ in the neighborhood of the heart had told her, the heart. And I got plenty more where that came from. Right. So, I mean, it's an interesting kind of twist, right? And it kind of, in a more dramatic fashion, sort of suggests what would happen later on in the social security office, right? Like it's like this like thing where like on the one hand, yes, she's an old lady. She's not totally aware of how the world works. She has lots of fears that are both correct as well as perhaps a bit misplaced. But she's also kind of like, she's also world weary and world wary, and also definitely has some understanding. I mean, she's walking around and she has to follow certain cues, like, okay, there's enough commuters here that I feel safe. I have to carry this knife. I don't carry a pocketbook past 5 p.m. Right. There's definitely, a lot of that. Right. And ultimately, she still continues getting the checks. Right.
Yeah. Well, it's, tying it back to the story Young Lions, assuming that these two things are connected. It's interesting the differential effects of actions on like two different people involved in the same thing, because it barely merits a sentence for Caesar in his story, whereas it seems to be like a seminal event in this late arc of her life for her. And it actually does show her to be kind of a badass or whatever, because like he's a fucking murderer. Like he could have killed her. So good, good for her, honestly. But something I was thinking about as we were talking about this is it's kind of interesting to compare this to the movie Wild Strawberries by Ingmar Bergman. To see sort of the comparison of a reflection on old age and the way that it affects one varies between two very, very different characters. This old kind of wealthy white guy who is pretty comfortable and doesn't have a lot in this world that he really has to worry about, and is free in his late years to just sort of reflect on his life and what it has meant and what it could still mean and what is his legacy going to be, where he's, she's old, but she is not in any sense removed from precarity. She is not in any sense removed from danger. She is at risk of pickpockets and violent people. She is constantly at risk of having her Social Security checks taken away from her if somebody, if she got sick and couldn't go into the office and didn't have any means of contacting them, she might be SOL, and that's probably what that's the money that she lives on. I can't imagine that she has much of a savings. Nobody has much of a savings, and that goes doubly so for Black individuals in this country. So, it's, it's, you could say that it's a stretch of a comparison, but it's, there are plenty of stories about like old aging white guys trying to come to terms with themselves, but not a lot of stories about like old Black women who really don't have the space or the time to come to terms with themselves in that same way, which is why I think Ed Jones introduces this character of the Howard University student that comes in and is doing like a folklore project of these like older Black people in this senior building where she lives, where he's having them record as much of their life as they can onto video cassettes, and presumably is going to compile them into something like a Black Studs Terkel or something like that, and gives her copies that she can listen to.
Yeah. What do you make of that, ending in particular, right? Because like on the one hand, we see, like lots of like little bits of evidence, right, that she's someone that maybe has had an interesting life, or at least maybe a life of some kind of depth, right? She's able to defend herself. She's able to look after her own interests. She's old, but she's also seems to be, pretty aware of her surroundings, even if we could say that she technically doesn't know how maybe Social Security offices work or like whatever. She's very kind of like aware of what she needs for her own life. And by the end of it, right, so she's kind of like recording into this recorder, like her own voice, right, talking about her life, talking about growing up, talking about just different things in her life. And she on the one hand doesn't like her voice, and then on the other hand, like I think the reader definitely gets the sense of, it makes sense to sort of end the story with these repeated kind of voiceovers, essentially, right? This kind of her own life kind of like playing out, being spoken of, being put into words, because there is some sort of substance there. There is this kind of depth, to whatever degree, and we have evidence of that starting out.
Yeah, in the same way that I think her and the young girl in the Girl Who Raised Pigeons story might be the most depthful characters in the story, in terms of, like, you could imagine that they might have an interesting perspective if they were to go on like an extended discourse about themselves and what they think about the world. The young girl at the start, when she's older, but you sense that she is on the verge of like escaping from this kind of small world that she is a part of and stepping into something larger. And she is at the end of it, and she, in reflecting back on it, seems to have a lot of interesting perspective and still be pretty sharp and have her reflexes about her. She stabbed a thug in the hand with it. She carries a switchblade.
Yeah. Well, it seems like it's a serrated kitchen knife of some sort.
Yeah, something like that. But anyway, And yet, despite the fact that she really does have an interesting perspective, she ultimately, after 86 years and all this shit, she's not fundamentally comfortable with herself and comfortable in her own skin.
Yeah.
And it's like kind of small t tragic, you know, like all of this interesting perspective and interesting life that she seemingly has lived. And yet she has nobody to share it with. She can't help but look with a little bit of resentment at this other old woman that is dating this old sickly guy, and yet she is moved by his death when she is there, at the end for it, and yet ultimately she can't really take any comfort in anything that has happened to her because she has never gotten any distance from it. I mean, she is essentially still in the shit. You know, she's as vulnerable as she ever has been in her life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like reflection does her no good. And if anything, could potentially like dull her senses.
Yeah.
You know, like it takes her out of the moment and instead puts her in like a fantasy world of reflecting on her past. And, you know, that's useful to some people, but it's not useful to her.
Yeah. And I mean, like, to the extent that we get like little bits and pieces of her life, we have these like italicized kind of, sections, right, where she's talking into the recorder. And I mean, like, the even as an older woman, right, that perhaps is a little bit, a little bit off in some ways, like she's, she does say interesting things even in these like recordings. So like the way that the final recording ends, I couldn't calm myself enough to listen to when the red cap said another train would be leaving for Baltimore. I was just that upset. I had a bunch of addresses of people we knew all the way from home up to Ballston, and I used one precious nickel to call a woman I hadn't seen in years because I didn't have the white people in Baltimore number. This woman come and got me, took me to her place. I remember like it was yesterday that we got in the streetcar marked 13th and DNE. The more I rode, the more brighter things got. You ain't lived till you've been on a streetcar. The further we went on that streetcar, dead down in the middle of the street, the more I know that I could never go live in Baltimore. I know that I could never live in a place that didn't have that streetcar and them clackety clack tracks. And then ultimately the story ends. She wrapped the tapes in 2 plastic bags and put them in the dresser drawer that contained all that was valuable to her. Birth and death certificates, silver dollars, life insurance policies, pictures of her husbands and the children they had given each other, and the grandchildren those children had given her, and the great-grands whose names she had trouble remembering. She set the tapes in the back corner of the drawer, away from the things she needed to get her hands on regularly. She knew that however long she lived, she would not ever again listen to them, for in the end, despite all that was on the tapes, she could not stand the sound of her own voice. And I mean, it's kind of implied, right? Like, for in the end, despite all that was on the tapes, it's sort of implying that there is something of value there. There is something worthwhile, that there is something that, you shouldn't be ashamed of your voice because you have some kind of input into the world that matters, right? But still, for whatever reason, we don't know why. We don't know, we don't know why this is happening, but she just can't deal with some aspect of herself, perhaps.
Yeah, it's very, very, very sad ending, and it's a book full of sad endings, so it's not to be unexpected, but it is kind of the right one to end on because, there's no, it would be false if the book ended on too much hope, because in some sense it's, lost in the city. I mean, this is someone who has been fundamentally and irrevocably lost in the city. She has lived there since she was like 20 years old or so. And yet at the end of her life, she has nothing that she truly feels proud about for having spent all of her time there, and that's unfortunate and sad. And all you can really do is just, I guess, hope that you live in a time that does a little better by people like that,
Yeah. Well, it's almost 1 a.m. here. Not that you guys would know, but we were actually just talking since 7 p.m. for like a couple hours, just straight up bullshitting before we even, started doing the artifact piece of all this. I wanted to wake up at 5:30 in the morning tomorrow, but I'm also someone that absolutely is adamant about getting a normal amount of sleep, so I'm not going to do that. But okay, so anybody that's watching this on YouTube, please hit like, please subscribe if you haven't done so. If you guys don't know, this is now available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, plus a bunch of other things. Pretty much whatever you got, I got you covered. So you could search for these episodes. Hopefully this is going to be up by the time you search. I don't know. You got anything else to say, Keith?
Good night.
All right. Good night, guys. Thank you for watching this entire thing. But you know what? Like, honestly, like show me another fucking show like this, just like straight up hardcore, 4 hours, story by story, giving everything its due. And like you don't have a discussion of this book like anywhere. Like you just can't find it. Not even Jones.
Yeah, it's relatively
really discusses
obscure
it.
for how good it is, honestly.
And also for how famous he is, that's just it's just kind of odd. But and honestly,
unfortunately he's a black man, so people only care about his slavery novel.
Yeah, and like I think it's sort of telling that in the kind of culture that we inhabit, the only reference that I have recently seen to this book was there was some tweet from like years ago, which I recognize as part from this book, where they were taking that quote from the store where the narrator is basically like, I didn't really want to break up with this girl, but I did. And I guess I wouldn't feel bad because, in this kind of ideal situation where every man would be able to freely break up with any woman as long as he knows that after breaking up, she was kind of like whisked away into like a castle somewhere, protected by eunuchs and by old women that, have only bad things to say about sex, right? Never to have sex with another man again. And that was like the quote that they isolated from the entire fucking book of short stories just to like talk shit about men. Right. And men's like sexual insecurities. Right. This is the extent of the things that they got out of this book. So
well, I mean, at least they got one thing rather than zero things.
And it was still a good quote, right? Might as well get it from him as opposed to whatever other garbage that these people want to peddle, right? But we don't peddle garbage in ArtiFact, as you can tell. So anyway, thank you for watching. We'll see you again soon.
Oh my God.